Step away from that Ferrari before I make this worse for you.
Malcolm Reed did not move an inch.
You already made it worse when you decided I could not own it.
His appearance told Vanessa everything she assumed.
A man like you does not arrive here in a car like that.
But Malcolm gave her one quiet warning.
Be very careful with the story you are about to tell.
Vanessa turned suspicion into a public accusation.
Someone call security! This man is trying to steal from my company!
The valet knew the truth was nearby.
Ma'am, I think you should look at the registration first.
Vanessa made sure he could not speak.
One more word, and you will lose this job tonight.
Malcolm protected him without raising his voice.
Do not punish him for telling the truth.
The truth is obvious. He does not belong beside a Ferrari.
The crowd watched Vanessa judge him openly. Still, Malcolm never looked afraid. Then police lights washed over the Ferrari.
Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Before you touch me, you may want to call your superiors.
But Malcolm's silence had a history. To understand why Malcolm Reed stood there so still while a woman tried to turn his life into a crime scene, you have to understand that he had survived far worse than being underestimated. He had built his entire life in rooms where people looked at him last, listened to him least, and then acted surprised when his ideas saved them. Malcolm had been born in a neighborhood where broken engines were more common than working streetlights, and where boys learned early that the world often noticed their mistakes faster than their talent. His father had driven buses for nearly 30 years. His mother cleaned offices and buildings where the executives never learned her name. But in their small garage behind the house, Malcolm found a language that did not care about status. Engines either worked or they did not. Metal either fit or it failed. A machine could be understood if a person had patience, discipline, and the humility to listen. As a child, Malcolm could not afford model cars, so he drew them. He sketched the curves of Italian sports cars from old magazines other people threw away. He studied the way light moved across the hood of a Ferrari, the way every line seemed to be a decision made by someone who understood speed as both science and poetry. But he did not love cars because they were expensive. He loved them because they were proof that imagination could become something real enough to touch. While other boys dreamed of owning a Ferrari, Malcolm dreamed of understanding why one existed at all. He wanted to know how beauty and engineering could meet in one object so perfectly that even a stranger on the sidewalk would stop breathing for half a second. That obsession carried him out of the neighborhood, through scholarships, late-night jobs, and years of being the only person in the room who looked like him. He became an engineer first, then a designer, then a businessman almost by accident. People who understood cars trusted him. People who understood numbers eventually had no choice but to respect him. But Malcolm never chased attention. Attention to him was a noisy room where people applauded before they understood the cost of what they were praising. He preferred quiet ownership. He preferred to build things and let others stand beneath the lights. It was a habit born partly from humility and partly from pain. The person who understood that pain best was his wife, Eleanor Reed. Eleanor had met Malcolm before anyone called him brilliant, before investors returned his calls, before his first company appeared in financial magazines. She had met him when he still carried engine grease under his fingernails and apology in his posture, as though the world had taught him to take up less space than he deserved. Eleanor never saw him that way. She saw the mind behind the quiet. She saw the patience behind the restraint. She saw a man who could walk past a showroom window and describe, from memory, how the car inside breathed. For years, Malcolm and Eleanor built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and extraordinary from within. She taught high school literature. He worked impossible hours in the automotive industry, first repairing what others broke, then designing systems that made luxury dealerships more efficient, more honest, and more profitable. He believed the car business did not have to be built on arrogance. He believed that people buying a dream should not be cheated by those selling it. Eleanor believed in him so completely that when he hesitated to start his own company, she placed a notebook on the kitchen table and filled the first page with the name she thought belonged to his future. Reed Caldwell Automotive Group. Caldwell was not Malcolm's name. It belonged to Richard Caldwell, a charming investor with old money, perfect teeth, and the kind of confidence that opened doors before he knocked. Richard had the connections Malcolm lacked. Malcolm had the vision Richard could never have invented. Together, they launched what would eventually become Caldwell Prestige Motors, a chain of high-end dealerships known for rare European cars, white glove service, and a reputation so polished that wealthy customers trusted it before reading the contracts. In the early days, Malcolm believed partnership meant shared purpose. He learned later that some people use partnership as a polite word for taking what another person built. Richard Caldwell liked Malcolm's mind, but he did not like Malcolm's presence at the front of the company. Investors, Richard warned, were more comfortable with a familiar face. Clients, he suggested, expected a certain image. Malcolm heard the meaning beneath every careful phrase. He had heard it his whole life. So he stayed behind the curtain and built the systems, trained the staff, negotiated the supplier relationships, and designed the customer ethics policy that became the company's hidden strength. Richard smiled at ribbon cuttings. Malcolm made sure the lights stayed on. Then came the betrayal. It was not dramatic at first. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives as missing paperwork, delayed signatures, board meetings rescheduled without notice, legal language no one explains until it is too late. By the time Malcolm realized Richard had tried to push him out, the company was already wearing another man's name like a stolen suit. Eleanor wanted him to fight publicly. She wanted the world to know who had built the foundation beneath Caldwell's marble floors. Malcolm wanted justice too, but he also knew the cost of a public battle. He had seen what powerful men could do when they felt exposed. He chose a slower kind of justice, one that required patience, discipline, and the kind of silence most people mistake for surrender. With Eleanor's help, Malcolm protected what mattered. Through a private family trust, carefully structured before Richard understood what was happening, Malcolm retained controlling interest in the holding company behind Caldwell Prestige Motors. Richard kept the spotlight. Malcolm kept the keys. The arrangement was strange, but it worked. Malcolm stepped away from the public face of the company and built a private investment firm that quietly rescued businesses, funded scholarships, and supported young mechanics who reminded him of the boy he used to be. Richard Caldwell enjoyed fame until illness and debt consumed the last years of his life. After his death, the Caldwell name remained, but the real power never sat where outsiders thought it did. Eleanor was the only person who knew how much that silence had cost him. She knew that every time Malcolm entered one of his own dealerships and watched employees fail to recognize him, a small part of him had to choose peace over pride. She also knew he was not weak. He was waiting. Not waiting for revenge exactly, but for the right moment to turn ownership into protection. She used to tell him that wealth was only meaningful when it defended people who had none. Malcolm carried those words long after Eleanor became ill, long after hospital rooms replaced business meetings, long after the woman who had believed in him before the world did left him with more money than he wanted, and one promise he could not forget. The Ferrari came from that promise. Years before Eleanor died, she and Malcolm had walked past a private collection after a charity dinner. Inside, under warm museum lights, was a deep red Ferrari, 812 super fast, elegant and aggressive, a machine that seemed to be moving even while parked. Eleanor had smiled at the way Malcolm stopped talking mid-sentence. She had known he was not seeing status. He was seeing childhood, survival, and design brought together in one impossible shape. She had told him that one day, when he finally stopped hiding from the life he had earned, he should buy one in red, not because rich men did, but because the boy in the garage deserved to see his dream in color. Malcolm did not buy it while she was alive. During her illness, extravagance felt obscene. After her funeral, it felt empty. But on the first anniversary of her passing, he purchased the Ferrari through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust, not as a trophy, but as a memorial. He had her initials engraved inside the cabin, where only someone looking closely would notice. He drove it rarely, and only on days connected to purpose. The car was not a toy. It was a reminder that grief could travel with beauty, and that promises made in love did not expire when a heartbeat stopped. The night of the Meridian Auto Museum Gala was one of those days. Caldwell Prestige Motors was sponsoring the event, at least publicly, but the real money came from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The gala was meant to launch a scholarship program for underprivileged students entering automotive engineering and technical training. Malcolm had insisted the program focus not on polished applicants with perfect resumes, but on young people who had learned from broken engines, family sacrifice, and necessity. He wanted the scholarship to find the version of himself the world had nearly missed. Vanessa Caldwell had other priorities. She was not Richard Caldwell's daughter, though she allowed people to assume the connection when it helped her. She had married briefly into the extended Caldwell family, kept the name after the divorce, and built a career out of appearing indispensable to men who confused Polish with competence. Vanessa had been appointed interim CEO after a leadership scandal shook the company, and she treated the temporary position as though it were a throne. She understood luxury branding, media optics, and the social choreography of wealthy rooms. She did not understand loyalty. She did not understand craftsmanship. And she certainly did not understand the kind of quiet power that did not need to introduce itself. To Vanessa, Caldwell Prestige Motors was an image to be sold. She wanted to merge the company with a foreign luxury conglomerate that had no interest in Malcolm's ethics policies, scholarship commitments, or employee protections. The sale would have given Vanessa an enormous personal bonus and a permanent title in the new organization. It also would have gutted the foundation Malcolm had built. Customer service departments would be outsourced. Longtime mechanics would be dismissed. The scholarship fund would be renamed, reduced, and folded into a marketing campaign. Vanessa called it modernization. Malcolm saw it for what it was: extraction disguised as progress. For months, Malcolm had watched from a distance as reports crossed his desk. Customer complaints rose. Employees resigned. Warranty claims were delayed to improve quarterly numbers. A small transfer from the charity budget had been labeled as event preparation. then moved again through consulting fees. No single entry proved corruption by itself, but together they created a pattern. Malcolm had seen enough patterns in his life to know when a machine was beginning to fail. He did not rush. He asked his legal team to gather documents. He asked the board chair to observe quietly. And then he accepted the invitation to attend the Meridian Gala in person. He did not tell Vanessa he was coming. He did not ask for a reserved entrance. He did not request a security escort or a press announcement. He drove himself in the Ferrari because Eleanor would have laughed at the idea of him arriving in a chauffeured sedan to a scholarship created in her name. He wore a simple navy jacket, a white shirt, and the watch Eleanor had given him when their first company turned a profit. The watch was not flashy. Its value was sentimental, not obvious. That was how Malcolm preferred most things. At the museum, the evening was already glittering when he arrived. The building curved in glass and steel around a central hall filled with historic race cars, polished engines, and photographs of drivers who had risked everything for speed. Wealth moved through the room with practiced ease. Champagne glasses caught the light. Sponsors smiled for cameras. Young scholarship applicants stood near the edges, dressed in borrowed suits and careful dresses, trying not to look overwhelmed by a world that had rarely opened doors for them. Malcolm noticed them first. He always noticed the people standing at the edges. One of those young people was Jordan Ellis, a valet assigned to the front entrance for the evening. Jordan was 22, nervous, and trying hard to appear invisible. 3 years earlier, he had been one bad month away from dropping out of a technical training program when an anonymous grant paid his tuition balance. He never learned the donor's name, only that the grant came from a trust connected to automotive education. What Jordan did not know yet was that the man stepping out of the red Ferrari was the reason he had a uniform, a job, and a future still within reach. Jordan recognized the car before he recognized the man. Everyone did. The Ferrari seemed to gather attention as naturally as fire gathers heat. Malcolm handed over no performance, no boast, no demand for special treatment. He simply greeted Jordan with respect, asked whether the staff had been given a place to eat during the long event, and waited for the answer with the seriousness of someone who considered that question important. Jordan was so startled by the courtesy that it took him a moment to respond. Most guests treated valet workers as extensions of the curb. Malcolm treated him as a person whose comfort mattered. That small exchange might have passed unnoticed if Vanessa Caldwell had not been standing near the entrance, preparing for a photographer. She saw the Ferrari first, then Malcolm, then Jordan's uncertain expression. In the space of a few seconds, her mind arranged those details into the only story her prejudice could accept. The car was too rare. The man was too understated. The valet looked too nervous. And the gala was too important for her to risk embarrassment. Vanessa did not approach like a host welcoming a donor. She approached like a property owner finding a stranger near the silverware. Malcolm saw the change in her face before she spoke. He had seen it in boutiques, hotels, boardrooms, country clubs, and once in the lobby of a bank that held more of his money than the manager earned in a decade. It was the look of someone deciding that evidence was unnecessary because assumption felt more natural. Vanessa asked for proof before she asked for his name. She looked at his jacket, then at the Ferrari, then at the gathering crowd, as though she were protecting civilization from a clerical error. Malcolm could have ended the moment there. He could have given his full name, called the board chair, or let one of the wealthiest families in the city learn within seconds who he was. But he had not come to the gala to perform power. He had come to watch what Caldwell had become when it believed he was absent. So he did what he had done for most of his life. He stayed calm, offered the simplest truth, and watched carefully to see who would choose fairness when fairness was inconvenient. Vanessa failed that test almost immediately. Vanessa Caldwell had spent her career learning how to turn uncertainty into authority. She knew that in wealthy spaces, the person who sounded most offended often controlled the room. So when Malcolm Reed calmly explained that the Ferrari belonged to him, she treated his calmness not as evidence of innocence, but as arrogance. She insisted that the vehicle matched one recently serviced by Caldwell Prestige Motors, and because her company had sponsored the gala, she claimed a responsibility to protect its assets, its reputation, and its guests. The words sounded professional enough from a distance. Up close, they were something uglier, wearing a tailored suit. Malcolm listened without interruption. That made people uneasy. A guilty man, they expected, would panic. An innocent man, they assumed, would defend himself loudly. Malcolm did neither. He stood beside the Ferrari with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that raising his voice would only make certain people feel justified in fearing him. He removed the registration card from a leather folder and offered it to Vanessa. She glanced at it only long enough to dismiss it. The name on the paperwork did not satisfy her because it did not match the story she had already chosen. Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust meant nothing to her except another obstacle between her accusation and the public victory she wanted. The crowd grew thicker. Guests who had come to celebrate charity now lingered for scandal. A few recorded openly. Others pretended to check messages while angling their phones toward Malcolm's face. This was how humiliation multiplied in the modern world. It no longer needed a courtroom or a newspaper. It needed only a confident liar, a silent crowd, and a camera hungry enough to turn a human being into content before the truth had time to breathe. Jordan Ellis stood near the valet podium with his hands tight at his sides. He knew something was wrong. The man beside the Ferrari did not move like a thief. He had arrived openly, not in a rush. He had spoken kindly. He had known to ask about the staff meal, a detail no ordinary guest noticed. Most importantly, Jordan had seen the registration card. He had caught the name of the trust, and something about it stirred a memory from the tuition letter he had kept folded in a shoebox at home. The grant that saved his future had come from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The same words were on the card Vanessa had just refused to believe. Jordan wanted to speak, but fear trapped him. His supervisor had warned the valet staff before the event that Vanessa Caldwell did not tolerate embarrassment. Workers who caused trouble would not be invited back. For Jordan, losing this job meant more than missing a paycheck. It meant falling behind on rent, delaying certification, maybe returning to the same dead-end work he had fought to escape. He watched Vanessa sharpen her accusation, and shame burned in him because he understood how silence could become cooperation. Inside the museum, the gala continued without understanding that its true purpose was being threatened outside the doors. Young students stood near displays of vintage engines, while donors congratulated themselves for generosity. A large banner promised a new future for overlooked talent in automotive engineering. Malcolm had funded that banner. He had funded the scholarships, the mentorship program, and the equipment grants that would follow. Yet outside, The man whose money made the evening possible was being treated as the danger. Vanessa's suspicion quickly became performance. She reminded everyone within earshot that Caldwell Prestige Motors dealt in vehicles worth more than most homes and could not afford to ignore irregularities. She emphasized that the Ferrari was a rare model, that criminals often targeted events like this, and that responsible leadership required swift action. Every sentence made her sound less like a woman seeking truth and more like someone auditioning for applause. The fact that Malcolm remained composed only irritated her further. She needed him to look guilty. She needed fear in his eyes. She needed the crowd to see what she believed she saw. When museum security arrived, Vanessa did not present uncertainty. She presented conclusion. She described Malcolm as an unauthorized individual attempting to take control of a high-value vehicle connected to her company. The words were careful, polished, and poisonous. They avoided the crudeness of open prejudice while carrying the same conclusion. This man didn't belong here, and therefore his ownership must be impossible. Malcolm again offered documentation. Again, Vanessa's certainty moved faster than anyone's willingness to verify. Security asked Malcolm to step away from the vehicle. He did. That small act of cooperation seemed to disappoint the people waiting for drama. He did not reach into his pocket suddenly. He did not challenge them with anger. He simply stepped back, folded his hands, and asked that the documents be checked before anyone treated an assumption as fact. One guard looked embarrassed. Another looked toward Vanessa, as though her title mattered more than the paperwork in Malcolm's hand. That glance told Malcolm almost everything he needed to know about the culture she had created. Vanessa noticed it too. Power teaches some people to recognize hesitation and punish it before it becomes courage. She pressed harder, reminding the guards that the entire gala was under media coverage and that any delay could become a reputational disaster. What she did not mention was that she had already created the disaster. In her mind, reputation meant controlling how things looked, not whether they were right. The first police car arrived 10 minutes later. To the crowd, it felt like confirmation. People who had been unsure now adjusted their faces into expressions of concern. Police lights have a way of turning suspicion into a script, and once that script begins, many people stop asking who wrote it. Malcolm watched the officers approach. He had known this possibility from the moment Vanessa raised her voice. He had also known that his wealth, his documents, and his education might not protect him quickly enough if the wrong person decided that his calmness was defiance. The lead officer, Daniel Price, was not cruel in the theatrical way Vanessa was cruel. His danger was quieter. He arrived with the fatigue of a man who believed he had seen enough to trust shortcuts. Vanessa gave him her version first. She did it quickly, confidently, and with just enough corporate language to sound credible. She described the Ferrari as possibly stolen from company custody, Malcolm as evasive, and the registration paperwork as suspicious. By the time Malcolm was invited to explain, he was no longer a man beside his own car. He was a suspect, attempting to overcome a story already planted. Malcolm handed over his identification and the registration card. Officer Price studied them, then studied Malcolm, then looked at Vanessa. That sequence mattered. The documents should have been the center of gravity. Instead, the officer's eyes kept returning to the woman in the expensive dress, who seemed so certain. Malcolm recognized the old imbalance. Paper was supposed to speak equally for everyone, but in the real world, paper often needed a powerful person to read it honestly. Vanessa grew bolder when she sensed the officer's uncertainty. She claimed there had been internal alerts about inventory irregularities at a Caldwell service facility. That part was not entirely false, which made the lie more dangerous. There had been irregularities, but they were not caused by Malcolm. They were caused by Vanessa's own pressure on employees to move vehicles and records in ways that made quarterly reports look cleaner than they were. One of those records involved a Ferrari recently serviced under a trust account. Vanessa had seen the paperwork days earlier and ignored the owner's name because she was focused on something else, hiding the fact that charity funds and service charges had been shifted between accounts before the merger review. The Ferrari, in other words, was not evidence of Malcolm's crime. It was evidence of Vanessa's panic. But no one outside the museum knew that yet. All they saw was a black man being questioned beside a car they assumed belonged to someone richer, louder, and more expected. Officer Price asked Malcolm why he had come to the event. Malcolm explained that he had been invited. Vanessa challenged that immediately, claiming she had personally reviewed the VIP list and did not recall seeing his name. She made memory sound like proof. Malcolm did not argue. He simply provided the digital invitation stored on his phone. Vanessa leaned in, saw the donor access credential, and for the first time a flicker of concern crossed her face. It disappeared quickly, but Malcolm saw it. The credential did not list him as Malcolm Reed. It listed him under the name of the trust. That was by his own design. For years, he had preferred the work to be recognized, not the man behind it. But now the privacy that had protected his peace gave Vanessa room to attack him. She suggested the invitation could have been obtained improperly. She suggested the trust name could be used as cover. She suggested anything that kept her from admitting the simplest possibility, that she had been wrong from the beginning. A younger officer asked whether someone from Caldwell's headquarters could verify the service records. Vanessa answered before Malcolm could. She insisted that she was the highest-ranking Caldwell executive present, and that her judgment should be sufficient until the vehicle could be impounded. The word impounded moved through the crowd like a spark. Phones lifted higher. Jordan's face tightened. Malcolm looked toward the Ferrari, not because he feared losing it, but because the thought of that car being dragged away under suspicion felt like an insult to Eleanor's memory. He remembered the day the Ferrari arrived. He had stood alone in the delivery room, while the dealer representative explained features Malcolm already understood better than he did. The car had gleamed beneath the lights, but Malcolm had not touched the steering wheel right away. He had placed his hand on the seat beside him, imagining Eleanor there, teasing him for pretending not to be emotional. He had whispered nothing aloud. He had only breathed through grief and gratitude until both became too large to separate. Now Vanessa was turning that memory into evidence of theft, and the cruelty of it settled deeper than her words. Still, Malcolm remained calm. Not because he felt nothing, but because he felt too much to waste it on spectacle. He asked Officer Price to contact the registration authority, the insurer, and the attorney listed on the trust documents. He also asked that the vehicle not be touched until its ownership was verified. The requests were reasonable. Vanessa treated them as manipulation. She accused him of trying to delay accountability and warned the officers that sophisticated thieves often used paperwork to confuse law enforcement. That phrase pleased her. It made prejudice sound like expertise. The situation might have turned then if Jordan had found his courage sooner. He stepped forward halfway, then stopped when Vanessa's assistant, a thin man named Miles Voss, moved beside him and quietly reminded him that temporary staff were replaceable. Miles did not need to raise his voice. Fear does not require volume when the power imbalance is clear. Jordan swallowed what he knew and stepped back. Malcolm saw the exchange. He did not blame the young man. He had once been young enough to know how expensive courage could be. Inside the museum, the gala program was nearing the scholarship announcement. Vanessa was supposed to appear on stage in 15 minutes. She knew that if Malcolm was still outside, if police were still questioning him, if guests kept filming, the evening would become impossible to control. So she made the choice that revealed her more clearly than anything she had said. She urged the officers to remove him from the entrance before donors became uncomfortable. Not before the truth was verified. Not before paperwork was checked. Before donors became uncomfortable. That was the moment Malcolm understood that Vanessa had to be removed from Caldwell, not merely corrected. A person who valued donor comfort over human dignity could not be trusted with a scholarship fund built for overlooked students. A leader who saw humiliation as a branding problem could not protect employees who lacked power. Malcolm had come to observe. Vanessa had given him the answer. Officer Price asked Malcolm to place his hands where they could be seen while they sorted things out. The request was framed as procedure, but procedure can feel very different, depending on whose body carries the risk. The crowd grew silent in the way crowds do when they know something wrong is happening, but want permission from authority before admitting it. Malcolm complied. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. He could feel Eleanor's initials inside the car behind him. He could feel old memories rising. The bank lobby, the hotel elevator, the showroom where a salesman once assumed he was the driver for someone else. Each memory carried the same message. Prove you belong. Prove you are not a threat. Prove you own what you built. Then Jordan finally moved. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. He stepped toward Officer Price with his hands trembling and explained that he had seen the registration card, that the trust name matched the scholarship donor materials, and that Malcolm had arrived as an invited guest. His voice shook, but truth does not need to be fearless to matter. Vanessa turned on him instantly. She accused him of interfering in a police matter and warned that his employment would be reviewed. The threat landed exactly where she aimed it. Jordan went pale, but he did not step back this time. That small act changed the air. One of the younger scholarship applicants inside the museum noticed the commotion through the glass. Then another. Soon, several students moved toward the entrance, drawn not by gossip, but by the uneasy recognition that the man outside looked more like their fathers, uncles, neighbors, and future selves than anyone on the gala stage. They had come to be celebrated by a company claiming to believe in overlooked talent. Now they were watching that company's acting CEO overlook truth in real time. Malcolm looked at Jordan with gratitude, but not surprise. Courage often begins as a whisper. He knew that. He also knew Vanessa would punish the young man if she survived the night with power intact. So Malcolm made one final request, this time not to the officer, but to the process itself. He asked that his attorney be contacted immediately and that the board chair of Caldwell Prestige Motors be informed that the trust's representative was being detained at the entrance of the event, funded by that same trust. Vanessa laughed at the phrase trust's representative, not loudly, but with enough contempt for those closest to hear. She thought Malcolm was dressing himself in legal language to escape consequence. She did not understand that he had just given her one last chance to pause before stepping over the edge. Officer Price, still unsure but increasingly aware that the situation was more complicated than Vanessa had claimed, allowed Malcolm to make a call. Malcolm did not call a friend to rescue him emotionally. He called Amina Pierce, the attorney who had protected his interests for 15 years and who had warned him that Vanessa Caldwell's ambition had finally become dangerous. He gave her only a few calm details: the museum entrance, the Ferrari, the attempted impound, the presence of police, and Vanessa's refusal to verify ownership. Amina did not need more. She had been waiting for the machine to expose its broken part. While they waited, Vanessa tried to reclaim control by moving the event forward. She instructed Miles to inform the stage manager that the scholarship announcement would be delayed due to a security issue. That phrase spread quickly through staff radios. Security issue. It sounded clean. It sounded neutral. It erased Malcolm's name, Vanessa's accusation, Jordan's courage, and the simple fact that the only danger present had been created by a woman who mistook her bias for leadership. Minutes passed. The crowd shifted. The police checked the license plate and found no stolen vehicle report. They checked Malcolm's identification and found no warrant, no record, no reason to restrain him. But Vanessa kept insisting that internal company records raised concern. She promised documentation from Caldwell's system, and Miles hurried to retrieve a tablet. When he returned, the record he showed listed the Ferrari as pending corporate hold. It looked official enough to confuse the officers. It was also false, altered that afternoon by someone using executive access. Malcolm saw the screen and understood. The accusation was no longer just prejudice. It was fraud being improvised in public. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Not into anger, not exactly, but into something colder. Disappointment, sharpened by certainty. Vanessa mistook it for fear and pressed forward, urging the officers to detain him until the discrepancy could be resolved. Officer Price reached for his cuffs, not with eagerness, but with the weary surrender of a man letting a flawed process carry him. Jordan stepped forward again, but a security guard blocked him. Several guests began recording closer. Vanessa's eyes brightened with victory. And in that suspended moment, as Malcolm Reed stood beside the Ferrari that carried his wife's initials, with one officer preparing to turn assumption into restraint, the glass doors of the museum opened behind the crowd. A woman in a gray suit entered with a leather case in one hand and the expression of someone who had not come to negotiate. Behind her walked Bernard Hayes, the board chair Vanessa had been trying to avoid for months, and Marisol Chen, Caldwell's chief financial officer, carrying a folder thick enough to end careers. Vanessa saw them and went still. Malcolm did not smile. He simply lowered his hands and waited for the truth to arrive. Amina Pierce did not need to raise her voice to take control of the entrance. Some people carry authority like jewelry, bright and decorative, meant to be noticed before it is useful. Amina carried it like a blade kept sharp in silence. She moved through the crowd without asking anyone to step aside, and still they did. Bernard Hayes followed with the exhausted look of a man who had ignored too many warning signs and was now watching them gather into proof. Marisol Chen kept her eyes on Vanessa, not with hatred, but with the clean sadness of someone who had finally confirmed what she had feared. Vanessa recovered first, or tried to. She spoke to Bernard as though this were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an uncooperative guest. She framed the police presence as a necessary precaution. She described Malcolm as evasive, the Ferrari as suspicious, and the altered company record as justification for every humiliating second that had passed. But her words no longer landed with the same force. Power depends on the room believing you are the highest authority present. Vanessa had just lost that illusion. Amina asked Officer Price to review the documents in her case before any further action was taken. This time, no one dismissed the paperwork. The first document established the Ferrari's ownership. The vehicle had been purchased legally, insured properly, and registered through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The VIN matched, the title matched, the insurance matched, the trust documents matched. There was no theft, no unauthorized possession, no legal basis for impoundment. The car belonged to the trust, and Malcolm Reed was its managing trustee. Officer Price's face changed as he read. It was not dramatic, but it was visible. The confidence he had borrowed from Vanessa drained away, leaving behind the discomfort of a man realizing he had nearly placed handcuffs on an innocent person because someone wealthy had sounded certain. He returned Malcolm's identification with a formality that could not repair the damage, but at least stopped it from growing. The younger officer looked relieved. The security guards looked away. Vanessa refused to surrender. She shifted from accusation to confusion, insisting that the internal Caldwell record still listed the car under corporate hold. Marisol Chen opened her folder. That was the moment Vanessa's fear became unmistakable. Marisol had spent weeks tracing irregular entries across Caldwell's systems. At first, she had believed the problem was sloppy management under pressure from the proposed merger. Then she found the charity transfers. Then, the delayed warranty reimbursements. Then, the executive overrides attached to vehicles used as collateral in internal reports. Finally, that afternoon, she saw the Ferrari record altered less than an hour before Malcolm arrived at the gala. The alteration had not been made by a clerk. It had been made through executive credentials assigned to Vanessa Caldwell's office. The crowd did not understand every technical detail, but they understood enough. They understood that the document Vanessa had used to justify suspicion had been changed from inside her own system. They understood that the man she had accused had shown real paperwork, while she had relied on a record that now looked manufactured. Most of all, they understood that the story they had been recording was not the one they thought. Their phones remained raised, but the mood behind them changed. Curiosity became recognition. Recognition became shame. Vanessa tried to blame Miles. Miles looked as though his soul had left him standing there with a tablet in his hands. For months, he had obeyed her, softened her threats into emails, arranged her meetings, and watched her treat fear as a management tool. Now, with police present and the board chair listening, loyalty became too expensive. He admitted that Vanessa had ordered him to pull the Ferrari's service history and flag it before the gala, claiming she needed leverage over an unnamed trust donor who might oppose the merger. He had not known she would turn that flag into a police accusation. That did not make him innocent, but it made the machinery visible. Bernard Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Malcolm watched him carefully. Bernard was not a villain, but cowardice in a boardroom can create space for villains to operate. He had allowed Vanessa's aggression because profits had risen. He had accepted her explanations because asking harder questions would have delayed the merger. He had told himself that leadership sometimes required sharp edges. Now those sharp edges had been turned on the very person whose trust kept Caldwell alive. Amina then presented the second set of documents. These were not about the Ferrari. They were about control. The Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust held the controlling interest in Reed Caldwell Holdings, the private entity that owned the majority of Caldwell Prestige Motors. Through that trust, Malcolm Reed possessed the authority Vanessa had spent months pretending she held without limits. He was not a random guest. He was not merely a donor. He was not an outsider trying to impress anyone with a sports car. He was the hidden founder, the principal owner, and the final vote on the merger Vanessa had built her future around. The silence that followed was deeper than the earlier silence. Earlier, people had been quiet because they were waiting to see a man punished. Now they were quiet because they understood. They had watched the owner of the company be treated like a criminal by his own acting CEO. Vanessa stared at Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time made the world unfair to her. That is the strange arrogance of people who judge too quickly. They are not horrified by the harm they caused. They are offended that the person they harmed turned out to have power. In her face, Malcolm saw no real remorse, only calculation collapsing. She was not thinking about the insult to his dignity. She was thinking about the merger bonus slipping away, the board votes dissolving, the headlines forming, and the video evidence spreading faster than her lawyers could contain it. Malcolm finally spoke, but even then, he did not perform anger for the crowd. He made it clear, in a measured way, that the issue had never been whether he could prove he owned the Ferrari. The issue was, what would have happened if he could not? What if he had been a mechanic, borrowing a customer's car with permission? What if he had been a young student from the scholarship program standing beside a vehicle he had been asked to move? What if he had been Jordan, or any worker whose documents were not enough to overcome a powerful person's assumption? Malcolm's calmness forced the crowd to confront the truth Vanessa had tried to hide behind procedure. The problem was not a misunderstanding. It was a system in which certain people were believed first, and others were forced to survive the consequences. Jordan stood near the valet podium, barely breathing. When Malcolm's eyes found him, the young man looked down, ashamed that he had hesitated. Malcolm did not let that shame settle. He acknowledged Jordan's courage in front of everyone, not as a dramatic reward, but as a correction. The first person at that entrance who had tried to protect the truth had not been a board member, an officer, or an executive. It had been a young valet with the most to lose. That fact embarrassed the powerful more than any speech could have. Vanessa attempted one last defense. She claimed she had acted out of concern for company property, but that argument collapsed under its own weight. Amina reminded the officers and the board that concern for property did not explain why Vanessa ignored valid registration, threatened a witness, pushed for impoundment before verification, or used an altered internal record. Marisol added the financial findings. Transfers from the scholarship event budget to consultant accounts tied to the merger campaign, delayed vendor payments hidden under administrative review, and pressure placed on employees who questioned the numbers. The Ferrari incident had exposed the pattern because Vanessa, in her haste to humiliate Malcolm, had reached for the same tools she used everywhere else: intimidation, optics, and manipulated records. Poetic justice does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives as a board chair asking for a badge to be surrendered. Bernard removed Vanessa as acting CEO on the spot, pending a formal investigation. The words were quiet, But they struck harder than any public insult she had thrown at Malcolm. The title she had used as a weapon disappeared in front of the same crowd she had tried to impress. Her access to company systems was suspended. The merger vote was postponed indefinitely. The police opened a separate inquiry into the altered record, and the charity fund she had treated as a branding tool was placed under independent protection by the trust she had mocked. Vanessa's face hardened as she realized there would be no graceful exit. Minutes earlier, she had wanted Malcolm removed from the entrance so donors would not feel uncomfortable. Now donors watched as she was escorted away from the gala she had planned to dominate. She had accused Malcolm of not belonging beside the Ferrari. In the end, she was the one who no longer belonged in the building. The same cameras she had welcomed for publicity captured her fall. The same crowd she had tried to command stepped back from her, as though arrogance itself had become contagious. Malcolm did not celebrate. That disappointed some people watching, but it revealed the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge would have demanded humiliation equal to the humiliation Vanessa had attempted. Justice required something more difficult and more lasting. Malcolm wanted the company repaired. He wanted the scholarship protected. He wanted employees free from fear. He wanted the students inside the museum to remember the night, not only as the night a powerful woman was exposed, but as the night a promise survived. The gala did not end. That was Malcolm's decision. Vanessa's removal created chaos, but Malcolm refused to let her failure become the students' punishment. After a delay, the guests were invited back into the main hall. The mood had changed completely. The champagne seemed less important. The speeches sounded thinner. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of charity now carried the uncomfortable knowledge that charity without dignity is only decoration. When Malcolm entered the hall, he did not enter like a conquering hero. He entered slowly, with Jordan beside him and Amina a few steps behind. The red Ferrari remained outside under the lights, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but of everything people had failed to see. Inside the museum, the scholarship applicants watched him with a different kind of attention. Earlier, some had wondered whether they belonged in such a polished room. Now they had seen the man who funded the room nearly thrown out of it. The lesson was painful, but it was also powerful. Belonging, they learned, is not always granted by the people guarding the door. Bernard Hayes took the stage first and admitted, with visible difficulty, that the evening's program had nearly been overshadowed by a failure of leadership. He did not reveal every legal detail, but he acknowledged enough for the room to understand that an apology was owed. Then Malcolm was introduced properly, not as a mysterious donor, not as a trust representative, but as the founder whose principles had shaped Caldwell before ambition distorted them. Some guests applauded too quickly, eager to move from discomfort to redemption. Malcolm let the applause fade before the room could use it to absolve itself. He did not give them the speech they expected. He did not describe his net worth. He did not tell a triumphant story about proving people wrong. Instead, he spoke about Eleanor. He spoke about a woman who believed talent often lives where opportunity refuses to look. He spoke about young mechanics who learn precision from necessity, about students who work night shifts before morning classes, about parents who sacrifice quietly so their children can build something better. He made the room understand that the scholarship was not a public relations gesture. It was a debt paid forward. As he spoke, the meaning of the Ferrari changed again. It was no longer merely a luxury car, or even evidence in a public accusation. It became part of a love story. Malcolm explained, without turning grief into spectacle, that the car carried Eleanor's initials because she had taught him to honor the dreams he once felt embarrassed to admit. She had believed that a boy from a forgotten garage could one day own beauty without apologizing for it. The room grew still, not with scandal this time, but with tenderness. Even those who had recorded his humiliation lowered their phones. The scholarship recipients were announced one by one. Jordan was not on the original list because he had already received support through the technical grant program years earlier. But by the end of the evening, Malcolm expanded the initiative. A new fellowship would be created for working students already inside the automotive industry, young people balancing jobs, training, and family obligations. Jordan would become its first mentor trainee, with full tuition support, paid certification leave, and a permanent position in Caldwell's technical development program if he chose it. The announcement was not charity tossed at him for good behavior. It was recognition of what courage had revealed. In the weeks that followed, the video spread far beyond the city. At first, people shared the most dramatic clip. Vanessa accusing Malcolm, the police lights flashing against the Ferrari, the moment Amina arrived with documents. But as longer footage emerged, the conversation changed. Viewers noticed Jordan trying to speak. They noticed Malcolm offering paperwork again and again. They noticed how quickly the crowd believed suspicion when it was spoken by someone expensive. The story became bigger than a Ferrari, bigger than a CEO losing her title, bigger even than one man's vindication. It became a mirror. Caldwell Prestige Motors underwent a reckoning. Malcolm did not burn the company down. He rebuilt its foundation in public. The proposed merger was canceled. An independent audit confirmed misuse of event funds and improper manipulation of internal records. Vanessa faced civil claims, regulatory scrutiny, and the permanent collapse of the image she had curated so carefully. Miles cooperated with investigators and was dismissed from his role. Bernard Hayes resigned from the board after admitting that oversight had failed under his leadership. Marisol Chen was appointed interim president, not because she was flawless, but because she had chosen the truth when silence would have protected her career. The company changed in ways that mattered. Employees received a protected channel for reporting misconduct. Valet workers, porters, mechanics, and junior staff were included in dignity and escalation policies that were not just printed in handbooks, but enforced. Customer contracts were rewritten in plain language. Warranty claims were reviewed. The scholarship fund was expanded and placed under a separate board that included educators, technicians, and former recipients. Malcolm insisted that the people most often ignored by luxury businesses should have a voice in how those businesses measured integrity. As for the Ferrari, Malcolm kept driving it, but not often. He brought it to the museum once each year for the scholarship ceremony, parking it not behind velvet ropes, but near the student entrance, where young people could see it up close. He allowed them to ask questions about the engine, the design, the balance between power and control. He loved those questions because they came from curiosity, not envy. He wanted them to understand that beauty did not belong only to those born near it. It could be studied, built, earned, and honored. 1 year after the incident, a small plaque was installed at the Meridian Auto Museum beside the scholarship wall. It bore Eleanor Reed's name, Malcolm Reed's name, and a sentence simple enough to be remembered by everyone who passed it. It said, that dignity is the first door opportunity must open. Malcolm stood before that plaque for a long time after the ceremony ended. No cameras surrounded him then. No crowd demanded a reaction. Jordan, now wearing a technician's jacket instead of a valet uniform, stood nearby and said nothing, because some moments are too full for speech. Malcolm thought about the night Vanessa tried to reduce him to a suspect beside his own car. He thought about the officers, the crowd, the phones, the silence. He thought about how close the truth had come to being delayed by confidence, title, and assumption. He knew that his wealth had helped protect him. His attorney had arrived. His documents had been recognized. His ownership had been too large to ignore. But he also knew that many people never get that kind of rescue. Their truth is smaller on paper, easier to dismiss, and less profitable for strangers to defend. That knowledge kept him humble. It also kept him working. Vanessa eventually faded from headlines, though consequences followed her longer than attention did. She tried to rebuild her reputation through carefully worded statements about stress, misunderstanding, and procedural confusion. But the public had seen too much. More importantly, investigators had seen enough. The world she had built out of image could not survive contact with evidence. For a woman who had valued reputation above character, the punishment was brutally fitting. She had spent years polishing a name while neglecting the truth beneath it. In the end, the name tarnished exactly where the truth had been ignored. Malcolm never said he forgave her publicly. He also never let bitterness become his legacy. Eleanor had taught him that justice should protect the future, not merely punish the past. So he chose to build. He built scholarships. He built protections. He built a company where a young worker could challenge an executive without risking everything. He built the kind of door he wished had opened more easily when he was young. And the red Ferrari remained what it had always been, no matter what Vanessa tried to make it. Not proof of arrogance, not an invitation to envy, not a symbol that one man had become better than anyone else. It was a promise kept. It was a reminder that a boy who once fixed engines under weak garage lights had lived long enough to honor the woman who believed in him. It was also a warning to anyone who judged ownership by appearance, intelligence by accent, dignity by clothing, or worth by the comfort of their assumptions. Because sometimes the quiet man beside the car is not lost. Sometimes he is not lucky. Sometimes he's not trying to impress anyone at all. Sometimes he is the one who built the road, paid for the lights, opened the doors, and still waits patiently to see who will treat him with respect before they know his name. So the next time you see someone standing where you do not expect them to stand, pause before you turn your assumption into a sentence over their life. The truth does not become smaller because it arrives quietly. Dignity does not disappear because someone powerful refuses to recognize it. And kindness, when protected by courage, can outlast arrogance every single time. If this story reminded you that no one should have to prove their humanity before being treated with respect, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell us in the comments whether you think Malcolm gave Vanessa exactly the justice she deserved. After a long day of airports and travel, Marcus wanted only one quiet room where his exhausted little daughter could finally rest.
Dad, are we finally home for tonight?
Before Marcus had even finished speaking, Derek looked at his clothes and decided that he did not belong there.
I'm sorry, sir. We have no rooms available.
Marcus did not argue. He simply watched Derek's polite expression turn cold when he realized Marcus looked like an ordinary traveler.
Could you please check once more? My daughter is exhausted.
Only moments later, a wealthy-looking couple arrived.
Welcome. We have a beautiful room ready for you.
And suddenly, Derek had a room ready without hesitation. That small movement told Marcus everything. There had been rooms all along. The lie had been about appearance.
So the rooms were never the problem.
Maya could see the truth on the reservation screen. Rooms were open, but fear kept her silent.
There are rooms, I know there are.
Marcus knew children could feel humiliation long before they understood the word for it.
Their choices say nothing about who we are.
Marcus did not raise his voice. He asked only to speak with the manager and have the system checked honestly.
Then let me speak with your manager.
Derek brought Richard from the back office, and Richard arrived already convinced that Marcus was the problem.
I'm told you are causing a disturbance.
Richard did not ask what happened or check the system. He looked at Marcus and decided he did not belong.
This hotel maintains standards, sir.
Escort them outside before this becomes more serious.
Richard called security and ordered Marcus and Zoe removed, turning a simple request for honesty into public humiliation. For several seconds, he said nothing. He stood beneath the soft gold lights of the lobby, while Zoe leaned against him, her small body heavy with exhaustion. The polished marble floor reflected the chandelier overhead. Somewhere near the lounge, a pianist played a slow, elegant melody. Guests drifted through the lobby with designer luggage, expensive watches, and the relaxed confidence of people who had never needed to wonder whether a door would be opened for them. And in the middle of all that comfort, Marcus and his daughter had been made to feel like an inconvenience. Derek had already turned his attention back to the couple who had arrived after them. His voice changed the moment he spoke to them. It became warmer, brighter, polished in a way it had never been when he spoke to Marcus. He welcomed them with the kind of smile that belonged in brochures and advertisements. He asked about their trip. He complimented their luggage. He spoke about the hotel's amenities, as though he were personally proud of every polished surface in the building. Then, without even checking twice, he assigned them a room. Marcus watched the key card slide across the counter. That small movement told him everything. There had been rooms. There had always been rooms. The lie had never been about availability. It had been about appearance. Zoe lifted her face from Marcus's side and looked toward the desk. She was too tired to be fully upset, but she was old enough to sense when adults were being unfair. Her eyes followed Derek as he gave the other guests directions toward the elevator. Marcus looked down at her and gently adjusted the strap of her backpack. He had promised her a warm shower, room service, and a bed with too many pillows. Before their flight, he had told her that they would make a little adventure out of the night, even though they both knew they were tired. Zoe had smiled at that idea. She had spent most of the flight curled against him, holding the small stuffed rabbit she brought everywhere. Now, her excitement had disappeared. Marcus had learned long ago that children could feel humiliation before they knew the word for it. They could hear it in the tone adults used. They could see it in the way people looked away. They could sense it in the sudden stiffness of a room when someone decided they did not belong. Marcus had seen that truth in his own childhood. His father had worked as a night security guard for nearly 30 years. Not in one grand hotel, but in several. He had worked in office buildings, private clubs, luxury apartment towers, and restaurants where the customers spent in one evening what he earned in a month. He wore a uniform every night, stood near entrances for hours, opened doors for people who rarely looked at him, and walked empty hallways long after the city had gone quiet. Marcus remembered waiting up for him as a boy. He remembered the sound of his father's keys at the door after midnight. He remembered the tired way his father took off his shoes in the kitchen, trying not to wake anyone. He remembered the faint smell of rain, coffee, and the cold night air clinging to his coat. Most of all, he remembered how his father never complained. But children notice more than adults think. Marcus had heard enough fragments of conversation to understand that his father was treated differently by some people. He had heard about guests who snapped their fingers instead of saying hello. Managers who spoke to him as though he were invisible. People who assumed he was uneducated because he wore a uniform. People who called him only when they needed help, then looked through him the moment the problem was solved. His father had always told him that work had dignity, no matter what title came with it. But Marcus had also seen the sadness in his father's face on the nights when dignity was the only thing anyone had left him. That was why Marcus never forgot the feeling of being judged before being known. It was why he built his company with a different kind of promise. Years later, when Marcus had begun buying struggling hotels and turning them around, people had assumed his greatest advantage was his business instinct. They saw the growth, the renovations, the partnerships, the expansion into new cities. They saw a successful entrepreneur with a sharp eye for numbers and an even sharper eye for opportunity. What they did not always understand was that Marcus had never wanted to build hotels merely to create wealth. He wanted to create places where people felt human. He wanted every guest to feel welcome, whether they arrived in a suit or a sweatshirt, whether they had booked the penthouse or the smallest available room, whether they were famous, wealthy, tired, grieving, alone, or simply trying to make it through the night. He had built that principle into the company from the beginning. Respect before revenue, care before appearances, hospitality without judgment. Those were not slogans to Marcus. They were personal. And yet, standing in that lobby with Zoe half asleep beside him, he could feel those values slipping through the hands of people who had never understood them. Marcus finally looked at Derek again. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand attention. He simply asked whether Derek would be willing to check the system one more time. It was a reasonable request. A tired father asking for a room for his child. Nothing more. But Derek's smile faded. The warmth he had shown the wealthy couple vanished, as though someone had switched off a light. He stared at Marcus with the irritation of a man who believed he had already ended the conversation and should not have to repeat himself. He insisted that the hotel was fully booked. Then he added that Marcus might have better luck somewhere more suitable. The words were carefully chosen. Derek did not say exactly what he meant. He did not need to. The insult lived in the pause before the final word. It lived in the look he gave Marcus's hoodie. It lived in the quick glance toward Zoe, as though the presence of a tired child made them even more out of place. Some of the nearby guests heard it. A woman seated near the lounge lowered her magazine and looked toward the desk. A man waiting beside the elevators glanced over his shoulder. The bell attendant near the entrance shifted slightly, uncertain whether he should pretend not to notice. Behind the desk, Maya stood very still. She had been watching from the beginning. Maya had worked at the hotel for almost 2 years. She was good at her job. She remembered guest preferences, kept track of small details, and treated nervous travelers with patience. She was the kind of employee who noticed when someone needed help before they asked for it. But she had also learned something during those 2 years. The hotel had rules on paper, and then it had unspoken rules in practice. Richard, the evening manager, had his favorites. Derek was one of them. Derek had been there longer. He knew how to flatter important guests. He knew how to make wealthy customers feel seen. He had a polished manner that management often mistook for excellence. But Maya had seen another side of him. She had watched him become impatient with guests who spoke with accents. She had seen him dismiss people who looked nervous about money. She had heard him make jokes in the break room about people who did not fit the image he believed the hotel should project. Maya had never agreed with him, but she had never openly challenged him either. She had told herself that she was trying to keep her job. She had told herself that speaking up would only make things worse. She had told herself that someone with more authority would eventually notice. But as she looked at Zoe, tired and confused beside her father, those excuses began to feel smaller. Maya could see the reservation screen from where she stood. She knew exactly how many rooms were available. There were 12 standard rooms still open, 4 junior suites, 2 family suites, and 1 corner suite on the 18th floor that had been held back for late arrivals. She could have said something. One sentence would have been enough. But fear had a way of making silence feel safer than truth. Marcus noticed her hesitation. He saw the way her eyes moved from the screen to Derek, then from Derek to Zoe. He saw the guilt settle into her face. He did not know her name yet, but he understood what he was seeing. Maya was not cruel. She was afraid. And fear, Marcus knew, could make good people stand still while something wrong unfolded in front of them. He turned his attention back to Derek. There was no anger in his voice when he asked whether he could speak with the manager. That request changed the atmosphere immediately. Derek's posture stiffened. For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered across his face. It lasted only a moment, but Marcus saw it. Derek knew that a manager could check the system. A manager could see that rooms were available. A manager could ask why a guest had been turned away while others were welcomed. But Derek also knew something else. Richard trusted him, and Richard had his own ideas about who belonged in the hotel. Derek disappeared through the door behind the desk. As he went, Maya kept her eyes on Marcus. She looked as though she wanted to apologize, but no words came. Zoe tugged gently at Marcus's sleeve. Her voice was quiet. She asked why the man at the desk did not want to help them. Marcus looked down at her, and for the first time that night, a little pain moved across his face. Not because Derek had insulted him. Marcus could handle that. He had spent his life learning how to survive other people's assumptions. What hurt was that Zoe had been pulled into it. She was young enough to believe hotels were places where people smiled at you, gave you little soaps, and told you where the elevators were. She had not yet learned that some adults treated kindness like a privilege instead of a responsibility. Marcus did not want that lesson to reach her tonight. So he told her, gently, that sometimes people made decisions before they knew the full story. He told her that it did not mean they were right. He told her that the way someone treated you said more about their character than it did about yours. Zoe listened quietly. Then she rested her head against him again. That simple gesture made the woman near the lounge look away for a moment. She suddenly seemed embarrassed to be watching. The businessman near the elevator checked his phone, but not because he had received a message. He was avoiding the discomfort in the air. The lobby had become a place where everyone could see the unfairness, but no one yet knew what to do about it. A few minutes later, Richard came through the back office door. He moved with the confidence of a man who had spent too long being obeyed. His suit was perfectly tailored. His tie was straight. His shoes were polished enough to reflect the lobby lights. He looked less like someone arriving to solve a problem and more like someone arriving to shut one down. Derek walked beside him, speaking in a low voice. Marcus could not hear every word, but he did not need to. Derek's body language told the story. He leaned toward Richard. He gestured toward Marcus. He shook his head as though he were describing an unreasonable guest, a disruptive guest, a difficult guest. By the time Richard reached the front desk, he had already chosen a side. He did not begin by asking Marcus what happened. He did not ask to see the reservation system. He did not ask Maya whether there were rooms available. He did not ask why another couple had been checked in moments after Marcus was told the hotel was full. Instead, he looked Marcus up and down. It was a brief glance, but it carried years of judgment. Marcus had seen that glance in boardrooms before people knew his name. He had seen it in restaurants when hosts assumed he was waiting for someone else. He had seen it in private meetings when executives assumed the older white man beside him was the real decision maker. Richard looked at Marcus the same way. Not as a guest, not as a father, not as a person who might deserve the benefit of the doubt, but as a problem. Richard asked what the issue was. Marcus explained calmly. He said he had asked for a room for himself and his daughter. He said Derek had told him there were none available. He said another couple had arrived after them and had been given a room immediately. He asked only that someone check the system honestly. His voice remained controlled. That made Richard even more dismissive. Richard listened with the shallow patience of someone pretending to be fair. Then he turned to Derek, who repeated the lie with more confidence now that his manager was standing beside him. Derek claimed that the rooms had been reserved for priority guests. Marcus asked what priority meant. Richard answered that certain reservations and memberships received special consideration. It was not a complete lie. Luxury hotels did have systems for priority guests, but it was not the truth either. The rooms Derek had assigned were not reserved for anyone. The couple had simply walked in. No special membership had been checked. No priority status had been confirmed. Richard was using policy as a shield, and Marcus recognized it immediately. Policies were supposed to guide people toward fairness, but in the wrong hands they became excuses for cruelty. Marcus asked Richard to show him the policy. Richard's expression hardened. The request was still calm, still reasonable, but Richard heard it as a challenge. He told Marcus that guests did not get to demand internal documents. He suggested that Marcus was misunderstanding how luxury hospitality worked. He said the hotel maintained certain standards and that the staff had the right to make decisions that protected the experience of its guests. The words were polished. The meaning was ugly. Marcus looked around the lobby. He noticed the guests listening now. He noticed Maya's hands trembling slightly near the keyboard. He noticed the security guard standing near the entrance, who had been quietly summoned by Derek while Richard spoke. The guard was a broad-shouldered man named Daniel. He had worked in security for years. Unlike Derek and Richard, he did not appear smug or pleased by the situation. He looked uncomfortable. His eyes moved from Marcus to Zoe, then back to Richard. Daniel had seen difficult guests before. He had dealt with yelling, threats, intoxicated visitors, stolen luggage, and arguments that got out of control. But Marcus was not shouting. He was not threatening anyone. He was standing quietly beside an exhausted little girl and asking why the truth could not be checked. Daniel knew the difference between a problem and a person being treated like one. Still, Richard had authority, and authority had a way of making decent people question their own instincts. Richard's voice grew colder. He told Marcus that the hotel was not able to accommodate him, and that it would be best for him to leave before the matter became more complicated. Marcus asked one final question. He asked Richard whether he was refusing him because there were truly no rooms available, or because Richard had decided Marcus did not look like the kind of guest the hotel wanted. For the first time, Richard looked genuinely irritated. His face tightened. His eyes shifted toward the other guests. He did not want to answer directly, because the truth would sound terrible out loud. So instead, he accused Marcus of trying to create a scene. That was the tactic. When people could not defend what they had done, they often changed the subject. They turned the victim's calm questions into aggression. They called truth inconvenient. They called dignity difficult. They hoped that embarrassment would force the other person to leave before anyone had to confront the real issue. Richard told Daniel to escort Marcus and Zoe outside. The words landed heavily in the lobby. Zoe looked up at her father again. This time, she did not ask why they could not have a room. She asked why the hotel workers were trying to make them leave when helping people was supposed to be their job. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the lobby more sharply than any shout could have. For a moment, no one moved. Derek looked away. Maya closed her eyes briefly, as though she could no longer bear to watch. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped. Richard's jaw tightened. The woman near the lounge placed her magazine on the table. The businessman by the elevator no longer pretended not to be listening. Even the couple Derek had just checked in looked uncomfortable now. They had come in expecting a quiet night at a luxury hotel. Instead, they were watching a tired father and child being treated as though they had done something wrong simply by walking through the door. Marcus felt Zoe's hand slip into his. He held it carefully. Then he looked at Daniel. Marcus did not blame him. He could see that Daniel was not enjoying this. He could see the conflict in his face. Daniel was being told to follow orders, and Marcus understood that jobs could make people feel trapped. So Marcus spoke to him with respect. He told Daniel that he wasn't there to cause trouble. He said he would not resist. He only wanted the hotel to be honest about why it was trying to remove him and his daughter. Daniel nodded slightly. It was the smallest gesture, but it mattered. Because in that moment, Daniel was no longer looking at Marcus through Richard's eyes. He was seeing him clearly. And once a person began to see clearly, it became harder to keep pretending nothing was wrong. Richard, however, had already gone too far to step back gracefully. He told Marcus that if he refused to leave, the situation could become more serious. The threat was unnecessary. That was what made it so revealing. Marcus had not raised his voice. He had not insulted anyone. He had not even stepped away from the desk. But Richard wanted the power of making him feel small. He wanted Marcus to understand that he could be removed, dismissed, and humiliated without anyone caring. What Richard did not understand was that Marcus had spent a lifetime learning that dignity did not come from other people's approval. It came from what you refused to become when they tried to strip it away. Marcus looked around one last time. The lobby he had helped design was full of details he remembered personally. The lighting had been chosen to feel warm instead of intimidating. The seating had been arranged so travelers would not feel exposed when they arrived tired or alone. The welcome desk had been lowered slightly on one side, so guests in wheelchairs could check in comfortably. The training manuals for every employee in the company had repeated the same principle. Every person who entered the building should be treated as though their dignity mattered. Now, standing in that same lobby, Marcus saw how easily beautiful buildings could hide ugly behavior. He saw how a company could print values on paper and still fail the moment no one believed someone important was watching. That was why he had never announced his visits in advance. Marcus often traveled without assistance, without security, and without the polished image people expected from a hotel owner. He wanted to know what happened when the staff thought they were dealing with ordinary people. He wanted to see whether kindness existed only when cameras were on, executives were present, or wealthy guests were nearby. Most of the time, he was proud of what he found. Tonight, he was not. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and took out his phone. Derek watched with a faint smile, convinced Marcus was calling someone to complain. Richard assumed he was calling for a ride. Neither man looked worried. In their minds, they had already decided who Marcus was. A tired man, a rejected guest, Someone with no power. Someone they could push out of the building and forget by morning. Marcus scrolled through his contacts, found a number, and made one call. He did not speak loudly. He did not explain everything. He only said that he was at the downtown property, that there had been a serious failure in guest treatment, and that he needed Thomas Webb to come to the lobby immediately. Then he ended the call. Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. He asked whether Marcus was trying to intimidate the staff. Marcus did not answer. He simply looked at Zoe, then back at the front desk. The wait that followed felt longer than it really was. Maya stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the phone in Marcus's hand. Something about the way he had made the call unsettled her. It had not sounded like a complaint. It had not sounded like desperation. It had sounded like someone giving a calm instruction to a person who would understand exactly what it meant. Daniel noticed it too. The security guard shifted his stance and looked toward Richard. For the first time, doubt had become visible in his face. Derek tried to cover his discomfort by pretending nothing had changed. He began organizing papers on the desk. Richard straightened his tie. The couple who had checked in quietly stepped away from the counter, suddenly unsure whether they wanted to be part of what was happening. And then, from the far end of the lobby, the elevator doors opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out quickly. His name was Thomas Webb. He was the chief executive officer of the entire hotel group, and he was walking toward Marcus with an expression that made Derek, Richard, and Maya realize that the man in the gray hoodie was not who they thought he was. Not even close. Thomas Webb did not slow down as he crossed the lobby. The moment he saw Marcus standing beside Zoe, his entire expression changed. The urgency in his face was obvious, but what stunned everyone watching was the respect behind it. Thomas was not approaching Marcus like a manager coming to calm down an upset guest. He was approaching him like someone who had just realized that a serious failure had taken place under the roof of the man who owned the entire company. Derek noticed it first. The confidence that had carried him through the evening disappeared almost instantly. His fingers stopped moving across the desk. His shoulders stiffened. He looked from Thomas to Marcus, then back to Thomas again, as though his mind could not make sense of what he was seeing. Richard's reaction was slower, but even more painful to watch. For several long seconds, he stood perfectly still. He had been so certain of himself moments earlier. He had believed the hotel belonged to people who looked polished, wealthy, and important. He had believed his title gave him the power to decide who deserved patience and who deserved humiliation. But now the chief executive officer of the entire hotel group was walking straight past him, not toward Derek, not toward the front desk, toward Marcus. Thomas reached Marcus and immediately apologized. He did not apologize in the vague, polished language managers often used when they wanted a problem to disappear. He apologized with the seriousness of a man who understood the damage had already been done. He said that he had come as quickly as he could. He said he had received Marcus's message and understood that something deeply wrong had happened. Then, in front of every guest, every employee, and every person who had watched the situation unfold, Thomas addressed Marcus with the title no one in that lobby had expected to hear. "Mr. Johnson." The silence became absolute. Maya's eyes widened. Daniel, the security guard, looked at Marcus again, but this time with a completely different understanding. The exhausted father in the gray hoodie was not simply a guest who had been treated unfairly. He was Marcus Johnson, the founder and owner of the hotel group. The man whose name appeared in annual reports, corporate training materials, investor conferences, and internal company messages. The man who had built the very hotel where Richard had tried to throw him out. Derek's face lost its color. Richard looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. But Marcus did not look triumphant. That was what made the moment even heavier. He did not smile. He did not step forward to embarrass them. He did not enjoy the fear in their faces. Instead, he looked down at Zoe, whose hand was still wrapped around his, then back at Thomas. Marcus told him that he had come to the hotel after a long flight with his daughter. He had asked for one room. He had been told there were none available. Then he had watched another couple receive a room only moments later. He explained that when he asked for clarification, he had been treated as a problem. When he asked for a manager, he had been judged before anyone checked the facts. And when he refused to accept a lie, he and his tired child had been threatened with removal from the building. Thomas listened without interrupting. His expression grew harder with every sentence. Marcus did not exaggerate. He did not need to. The truth was already standing in front of everyone. The reservation system was behind the desk. Maya had seen the available rooms. Daniel had heard Richard's order. The guests nearby had witnessed Derek's sudden change in attitude when the well-dressed couple entered. There was no confusion left, only accountability. Thomas turned to Richard first. He asked whether Marcus's account was accurate. Richard opened his mouth, but for the first time that night, he had no polished explanation ready. He tried to say that there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed that Derek had been following procedure. He suggested that the situation had become difficult because Marcus had challenged the staff in front of other guests. But even as he spoke, the weakness of his words became obvious. He had not checked the system. He had not asked Maya what she saw. He had not investigated the available rooms. He had not shown concern for Zoe. He had only looked at Marcus and decided that someone dressed like him did not deserve the same respect as someone dressed in expensive clothes. Thomas asked Richard a simple question. He asked whether the hotel's standards included judging guests by their appearance. Richard could not answer, because there was only one honest answer, and everyone knew it. Then Thomas turned to Derek. Derek tried to defend himself by claiming he had assumed the rooms needed to be held for preferred guests. He said he had been trying to protect the hotel's reputation. He said that he had not intended to insult Marcus or Zoe. But Marcus looked at him with a calm disappointment that was more powerful than anger. He told Derek that the problem was not whether Derek knew his identity. The problem was that Derek had believed it was acceptable to lie to a father and child because he thought they had no power. Marcus explained that respect was not something guests earned by wearing the right clothes. It was not a reward for wealth, status, or influence. It was the minimum every person deserved before anyone knew their name. Derek lowered his eyes. He had no answer for that either. Thomas asked Maya to step forward. At first, she looked frightened. She had spent the entire evening trapped between what she knew was right and what she feared might happen if she spoke. Her hands were shaking slightly as she came around the desk. She looked at Marcus, then at Thomas, then at Richard. Thomas asked her whether rooms had been available. Maya hesitated. For one painful second, it seemed as though fear might win again. Then she looked at Zoe. The little girl was still tired, still quiet, still holding her father's hand. But there was something about seeing Zoe there that finally broke through Maya's silence. She told the truth. She said there had been rooms available from the beginning. She said Derek knew it. She said she had seen open rooms in the system. She admitted that she had been afraid to challenge him because Richard always took Derek's side. She admitted that she should have spoken sooner. Her voice trembled as she said it. But once the truth started, it did not stop. Maya explained that this was not the first time Derek had judged guests based on appearance. She had seen him speak differently to people who seemed wealthy and important. She had seen him dismiss guests who looked uncertain, tired, or out of place. She had kept quiet because she had believed that speaking up would cost her the job she needed. Richard looked at her with disbelief, not because he was shocked by what Derek had done, but because he was shocked that Maya had finally found the courage to say it. Thomas listened carefully. Then he asked Daniel what he had witnessed. The security guard looked toward Richard, then toward Marcus. Daniel did not rush his answer. He was clearly uncomfortable being placed in the middle of the situation. But he spoke honestly. He said Marcus had never been aggressive. He said Zoe had been visibly exhausted. He said Richard had ordered him to escort them out, despite the fact that Marcus had only asked for a truthful explanation. Daniel admitted that he had known something felt wrong. He said he should have questioned the order sooner. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood what it meant for Daniel to say that in front of his manager. It took courage to admit when fear had almost made you part of an injustice. Thomas looked around the lobby. By then, no one was pretending not to watch. The woman near the lounge had stood up. The businessman by the elevator had moved closer. Even the couple who had been checked in ahead of Marcus looked ashamed. They had not asked for special treatment, but they had benefited from it without realizing someone else had been denied. Thomas addressed the entire room. He said that this hotel had not failed because a guest complained. It had failed because employees had forgotten the purpose of hospitality. The building was beautiful. The rooms were expensive. The service was supposed to be exceptional. But none of that mattered if a tired father and his child could walk through the front doors and be treated as though they were less worthy than everyone else. Then he looked directly at Derek. Thomas informed him that he was being terminated immediately. Derek stared at him. The words seemed to take a moment to sink in. He had believed the front desk gave him power. He had believed he could decide who deserved warmth and who deserved rejection. He had used a lie about room availability to make someone feel small. And now, in the same lobby where he had tried to deny Marcus a place to stay, he was losing the job that had made him feel important. But Derek's termination was not simply because he had insulted the owner. Marcus made that clear. Derek was being fired because he had lied to a guest, because he had judged people by appearance, because he had used the hotel's name to make cruelty look like policy, and because he had forgotten that hospitality was not a costume you wore for wealthy people. It was a responsibility. Derek tried to speak. He tried to explain that he had not known who Marcus was. Marcus stopped him gently. He told Derek that knowing would have changed nothing. That was the point. Derek should have treated Marcus with dignity, even if he had been an unknown traveler with no money, no title, and no influence. He should have treated Zoe with kindness because she was a tired child, not because she happened to be the daughter of the hotel owner. The truth settled over the lobby like a weight. Then Thomas turned toward Richard. Richard had been quiet for several minutes. His face had become stiff and pale. He seemed to understand that his position was no longer safe, but he still tried to hold on to the authority that had failed him. He said he had been following the information given to him. He said he had trusted his senior employee. He said he had been trying to protect the hotel from disruption. Marcus listened without expression. Then he reminded Richard that leadership was not about blindly protecting the people beneath you. Leadership was about asking questions when something did not feel right. It was about defending fairness even when it was inconvenient. It was about protecting guests, employees, and the values of the organization. Richard had not done any of those things. He had not checked the facts. He had not listened to Marcus. He had not noticed Zoe. He had used his position to make another human being feel powerless. And when he saw a man in a hoodie asking for fairness, he had decided that humiliation was easier than investigation. Thomas informed Richard that he was also being terminated, effective immediately. The difference between Derek and Richard was important. Derek had started the lie, but Richard had made it dangerous. He had taken a moment of prejudice and turned it into public humiliation. He had taken a tired father's request for a room and treated it like a threat. He had ordered security to remove a child from the hotel rather than admit that his employee might be wrong. That was why the consequences had to be serious. Richard's title had not protected him. His suit had not protected him. His confidence had not protected him. Because in the end, the power he thought he had was never meant to make others feel small. It was meant to make them feel safe. Marcus stood quietly as Derek and Richard were asked to leave the front desk area. Neither man received the scene they might have expected. No shouting, no dramatic revenge, no cruel words thrown back at them. Marcus did not need to humiliate them. Their own choices had already done that. The same people they had judged by appearances had watched them reveal their true character. The same lobby where they had tried to push Marcus out had become the place where everyone saw that their authority had been hollow all along. After they left, the lobby remained silent. Then Marcus turned to Maya. She looked terrified that she would be next. She admitted again that she should have spoken up earlier. She said she had known the rooms were available. She said she had seen the injustice, but had been afraid of Richard. She did not try to excuse herself. She did not pretend she had done enough. Marcus studied her for a moment. He understood that silence could cause harm. But he also understood that courage was not always loud at first. Sometimes it arrived late, trembling and uncertain, but still honest. Marcus told Maya that she had made a mistake by staying quiet. But he also told her that she had chosen truth when it mattered most. He said the company did not need employees who were afraid to protect what was right. It needed people who could learn from fear and become stronger because of it. Thomas nodded. Then Marcus asked Maya whether she was willing to help rebuild the culture at the hotel. Maya looked confused. Marcus explained that she would not be punished for telling the truth. Instead, she would be given an opportunity. She would be assigned to work directly with the hotel's guest experience and staff training team. Her role would be to help ensure that every employee understood what had gone wrong that night and why it could never happen again. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She had expected to lose everything. Instead, she had been given a chance to help create something better. Marcus then turned to Daniel. The security guard stood quietly near the entrance, still looking uncomfortable about how close he had come to escorting Marcus and Zoe outside. Marcus thanked him for stopping before the situation went further. He told Daniel that following orders was sometimes necessary, but it should never mean abandoning conscience. He said that a security guard's job was not only to protect property, it was to protect people. Daniel nodded, visibly moved. Marcus told Thomas that Daniel should remain in his position and be included in the next round of training. Not as punishment, but as a reminder that every employee, no matter their role, had the power to stop harm when they saw it. Only then did Marcus look down at Zoe. The entire time, she had remained close to him. She had watched the adults change their voices. She had seen the people who were cold to them suddenly become nervous. She had seen her father remain calm, while everyone around him seemed to lose control. Marcus bent slightly and asked her if she was still tired. Zoe nodded. Then, with the honesty only a child could offer, she asked whether they could finally go to their room. The lobby softened. A few people smiled through the tension. Thomas immediately stepped forward, and offered to personally take them to the best available suite. But Marcus shook his head gently. He did not want the best room, because everyone now knew who he was. He wanted the room they should have been offered from the beginning. A clean, comfortable room for a father and daughter who had arrived tired after a long flight. Nothing more, and nothing less. Thomas understood. He asked Maya to prepare one of the family suites and make sure Zoe had everything she needed. Maya moved quickly, but this time her energy came from purpose rather than fear. She checked the reservation system herself. She selected a quiet room away from the elevators. She arranged for warm food, extra blankets, a child-sized robe, and a small basket of snacks. When she handed Marcus the key cards, her hands were steadier. She apologized again. Marcus accepted the apology, but he reminded her that the best apology was not what she said tonight. It was what she chose to do tomorrow. That night, Marcus and Zoe finally rode the elevator upstairs. As the doors closed, Zoe leaned against him and asked whether the hotel workers knew who he was now. Marcus looked at the numbers rising above the elevator doors. Then he told her that what mattered was not whether people knew who he was. What mattered was whether they learned to treat everyone kindly before they knew. 3 months later, the hotel looked the same from the outside. The marble still gleamed. The chandelier still hung above the lobby. The piano still played near the lounge. But inside, something had changed. Maya had become part of a new training program created across the entire hotel group. She was no longer just a receptionist trying to survive a difficult workplace. She had become a leader in guest experience, helping employees understand that hospitality was not about recognizing wealthy faces. It was about seeing human beings. The training sessions did not begin with numbers, sales goals, or luxury standards. They began with one question: how would you treat this person if you believed they had nothing to offer you? That question changed everything. Employees were taught to notice the tired parent, the nervous traveler, the older couple counting money carefully before checking in, the guest whose clothes did not match the hotel's expensive image, and the person who looked like they had nowhere else to go. They were taught that dignity should never depend on appearance. Daniel remained in security. He became known for his calm, respectful way of handling tense situations. He never forgot the night he almost followed an order he knew was wrong. And because he remembered it, he became more willing to speak up when something did not feel right. One rainy evening, 3 months after Marcus and Zoe had been denied a room, a family walked into the lobby. The father wore a faded jacket. The mother carried a sleeping toddler. Their luggage was old, and their shoes were wet from the rain. They looked exhausted. They looked uncertain. They looked like the kind of people Derek and Richard might once have dismissed before even hearing their names. But Maya saw them immediately. She stepped out from behind the desk before they had to ask for help. She welcomed them warmly. She asked whether they had traveled far. She noticed the child asleep against the mother's shoulder and offered them a quiet room away from the elevator. She did not look at their clothes. She did not look at their luggage. She did not make them prove that they belonged. She simply treated them as people who needed kindness. From the far side of the lobby, Marcus watched quietly. He had stopped by the hotel again without an announcement. This time, Zoe was with him too, holding her stuffed rabbit and looking much more awake than she had been 3 months earlier. She watched Maya help the family. Then she looked up at her father and smiled. Marcus smiled back. For the first time since that painful night, he felt that the hotel was beginning to become what he had always hoped it would be. Not perfect, but better. Because the real measure of a place was never the height of its ceilings, the shine of its floors, or the cost of its rooms. It was the way people were treated when no one believed they were important. Marcus had not won because he was the owner. He had won because he refused to let another person's prejudice take away his dignity. And Derek and Richard had not lost their jobs simply because they insulted a powerful man. They lost their jobs because they had forgotten something far more important. They had forgotten that every person deserves respect before they are asked to prove who they are. Because real character is not revealed by how we treat people who can reward us. It is revealed by how we treat the people we think cannot. And sometimes, the person standing quietly in front of you is not just a stranger. Sometimes, they are the moment that reveals who you truly are. If you believe kindness should never depend on status, share this story and tell us in the comments. Would you have spoken up if you had been standing in that lobby? At Halston's charity gala, 15-year-old Noah Bennett was accused of stealing the library's most valuable book. They dragged him forward. Everyone watched in silence.
You were trusted here.
Conrad wanted a confession.
What did you think would happen?
Noah refused to lie.
I did not steal it.
The room believed Conrad.
Then explain why you were hiding it.
But Noah had found it.
I found it in a crate.
Because the original was missing.
The original never left this library.
Then Evelyn stepped forward.
Don't let them take that book.
She knew the truth. The displayed book was fake.
The book under glass is a forgery.
Conrad finally looked afraid.
Be careful what you accuse me of.
He did not steal history. He found what you buried.
To understand why, go back 6 weeks. 6 weeks earlier, the Halston Heritage Library had not yet become the center of a scandal. It was still only an old public building on the east side of the city, standing between a bus station and a row of stores that changed owners every few years. Its limestone walls were stained by decades of rain. Its copper roof had darkened almost black. In winter, the pipes groaned beneath the floorboards, and in summer, the upper reading room carried the warm scent of dust, cedar shelves, old paper, and leather bindings that had survived longer than most of the people who once touched them. To wealthy people driving past in black cars, the library looked tired. It occupied valuable land near the river, close to luxury apartments, boutique hotels, and polished glass towers that had begun changing Halston beyond recognition. To developers, it was a property with potential. To city officials, it was a budget problem. To men like Conrad Vale, it was an opportunity waiting to be renamed. But to the people who used it every day, the library was something else entirely. Children came after school because it was quiet, safe, and warm. Older men came because they had nowhere else to sit after retirement. Mothers came to use the computers for job applications. Teenagers came to study, read, hide from arguments at home, or simply spend a few hours in a place where no one expected them to explain why life had become difficult. The library did not ask for proof of income. It did not care where a person slept. It did not demand that anyone explain their past before opening its doors. That was why Evelyn Hart had stayed there for so long. At 57, Evelyn had become the kind of woman people overlooked until they needed something only she could find. She was not loud. She did not dress to be noticed. Her gray-brown hair was always pinned neatly behind her head, and she wore thin cotton gloves whenever she handled old paper. Her clothes were simple, practical, and slightly old-fashioned. She moved through the archive rooms with careful, measured steps, as though every shelf held a memory that deserved respect. Officially, Evelyn was the library's senior archival assistant. It was a title that made her sound like someone who spent her days dusting books and filing records. In truth, she knew more about Halston's history than most of the men who gave speeches about it. She could identify a forged signature by the pressure of the ink. She could tell the age of a document by the fibers in its paper. She knew which streets had vanished beneath new construction, which neighborhoods had been renamed by investors, and which public promises had disappeared the moment money changed hands. Evelyn had built her life around those small traces, because 20 years earlier, she had learned what happened when powerful people believed they could erase them. Before coming to the library, Evelyn had been a forensic auditor for the city of Halston. She had worked in the municipal finance office, reviewing redevelopment budgets, public grants, housing contracts, and infrastructure programs. She had been good at her work. Too good, perhaps, for people who preferred financial reports to remain unread. At the time, Halston had been changing quickly. Old neighborhoods near the river were being cleared for redevelopment. Public housing projects were being repaired, relocated, or quietly abandoned. New foundations appeared every year, promising to rebuild struggling communities. Politicians praised private investment. Newspapers printed photographs of smiling developers standing beside ribbon cuttings and construction sites. One of those developers was Conrad Vale. Even then, Conrad had known how to make ambition sound like compassion. He was younger, hungrier, and far less famous than he would become. But the city already admired him. He spoke about restoring dignity to forgotten neighborhoods. He donated coats during winter drives. He appeared at school fundraisers. He made people feel that Halston's future depended on men like him. Evelyn had not disliked him at first. She had only followed the numbers. The more she reviewed the finances connected to the city's redevelopment programs, the more she noticed patterns that made no sense. Public funds intended for housing repairs were being transferred into charitable accounts. Those accounts paid consulting fees to private firms. The firms were connected to contractors. The contractors were connected to land purchases. The land purchases eventually led back to companies linked to Conrad Vale and his earliest business partners. Nothing had been stolen in one obvious act. That was what made the scheme so difficult to see. The money moved in fragments. It passed through foundations with hopeful names. It was hidden inside consulting contracts, administrative costs, redevelopment fees, and emergency transfers. Each transaction looked harmless by itself. But when Evelyn placed them beside one another, a pattern appeared. Public money was being used to help private interests control public land. Evelyn needed proof before she could report it. She needed someone who understood the city's old records, someone who knew where the original deeds and transfer documents had been stored. That person was Arthur Bennett. Arthur had been a municipal records clerk, quiet, patient, and almost invisible to the people who worked above him. He had no powerful friends. He had no political ambition. He was the kind of man who remembered the exact shelf where a file had been placed 15 years earlier, even after 3 office moves and 2 changes in the archive system. Arthur had recognized the same irregularities Evelyn had found. Several land transfer records had been altered. Dates had been changed. Property classifications had shifted after signatures were supposedly completed. Documents had appeared in folders where they did not belong. Some records carried seals that had not existed at the dates printed on them. Together, Evelyn and Arthur had come close to exposing the truth. Then the documents began disappearing. Before Evelyn could deliver her final report, she was accused of manipulating city financial records. The same spreadsheets she had used to uncover fraud were suddenly presented as evidence against her. Money that had vanished through a complicated network of transfers was blamed on her department. The city needed someone to absorb the scandal, and Evelyn was convenient. She was not wealthy. She was not politically connected. She had no family name that could frighten the people accusing her. Arthur tried to defend her. He submitted notes about altered deeds and missing evidence. He insisted that files had been removed from the archive system. But his warnings were dismissed as paranoia. He was removed from his job. His reputation was damaged. Within months, the city had painted Evelyn as a dishonest auditor, and Arthur as a troubled clerk, unable to accept the conclusions of the investigation. Conrad Vale survived untouched. In fact, he emerged stronger. Over the next 2 decades, his company grew. Vale Horizons built luxury towers, shopping centers, private hospitals, and waterfront districts. Conrad funded scholarships. He donated to museums. He sponsored youth programs. His name appeared on plaques across the city, and Evelyn disappeared. She took temporary work restoring documents. She cataloged private collections. She repaired damaged books. Eventually, the Halston Heritage Library hired her because old paper did not care what the newspapers had once said about her. The library was one of the few places where she could work without hearing whispers whenever she entered a room. For 20 years, Evelyn had not tried to fight her past. She had survived it. Then Conrad Vale announced that he wanted to save the library. The proposal arrived with headlines, television interviews, and photographs of Conrad standing beneath the library's stone archway, while promising a new future for Halston's children. Vale Horizons would invest $40 million into a modern educational complex called the Vale Center for Tomorrow. The plan included a technology wing, a media lab, a scholarship center, a renovated children's library, and a sleek glass structure extending toward the river. The city celebrated before most people read the details. The mayor praised Conrad's generosity. The library board called it a miracle. Newspapers described the project as a lifeline for an aging institution that could no longer survive on public funding alone. People who had never visited the library suddenly had opinions about how it should be transformed. But Evelyn saw what the others did not. The agreement required the city to lease the library property to Vale Horizons for 99 years. The library itself would remain open, at least in theory. But much of the surrounding land would be converted into private retail space, corporate offices, luxury cafes, and event halls. The old building would become the decorative center of a much larger commercial project. It would survive as an image, not as a promise. Evelyn understood the danger immediately. A public library did not belong to the city officials who happened to manage it. It belonged to the people who needed it. And once the land was given to a private company for nearly a century, there would be no easy way to take it back. She began studying the legal documents late at night. Most of the agreement had been carefully written by expensive lawyers. But near the end of the planning folder, hidden behind technical maps and development schedules, Evelyn found an amendment dated 1978. It claimed that the original terms of the library's founding agreement had been changed decades earlier, allowing the city to transfer the property for private development under certain conditions. At first glance, the document looked convincing. The language was formal. The seal appeared official. The pages were yellowed enough to suggest age. The signatures looked authentic. It was exactly the sort of paper most people accepted without question, because it looked old and complicated. But Evelyn had spent too long studying the small places where lies failed. The seal at the bottom of the amendment belonged to a municipal archive classification system created in 1986. The paper contained a fiber blend that had not been used in city documents during the 1970s. The typeface was correct for the era, but the spacing between lines matched a template introduced years later. The document claimed to have been filed in 1978, yet the reference number followed a code system that did not exist until the late 80s. Someone had created an old lie using new tools. That night, Evelyn sat alone in her small apartment on Grant Street, surrounded by copied documents and handwritten notes. Trucks rumbled below her window. The laundromat downstairs had closed hours earlier, leaving the building quiet except for the low hum of old machines. A mug of tea cooled beside her lamp as she compared the forged amendment to real city records. The more she studied it, the more certain she became. Someone was trying to steal the library without calling it theft. The next morning, Evelyn brought her findings to Martin Gage, the library director. Martin was not a bad man. He had spent years trying to keep the library open through funding cuts, staff reductions, and public indifference. He had the tired face of someone who had learned to celebrate every small victory because larger victories no longer seemed possible. Evelyn explained the inconsistencies. She showed him the mismatched archive seal. She pointed out the paper fibers, the date problem, and the wrong filing system. Martin listened. He looked uneasy. He turned the pages slowly. Then he told her that the city legal department had already approved the agreement. Conrad Vale's team had spent months preparing the proposal. The library board had accepted the documents as legitimate. Martin suggested that Evelyn might be viewing the situation through the pain of what had happened to her years earlier. He did not accuse her of lying. That would have been easier. Instead, he implied that her past had made her suspicious of everything. Evelyn left his office without arguing. Downstairs, in the reading room, Noah Bennett was sorting returned books onto a cart. He was 15, thin, dark-haired, and taller than people expected when they first saw him. His clothes were clean but worn. The sleeves of his jacket had frayed at the cuffs, and his shoes had been repaired with black tape near the soles. Noah had been coming to the library for nearly a year. He lived in a foster home on the other side of Halston, with a couple who were doing their best, but already had too many responsibilities. There were other children in the house, too many rules, and not enough quiet. Noah had moved through 4 placements in 6 years. He had learned not to unpack fully. He had learned not to ask whether a room was really his. He had learned that adults often said they wanted honesty, but only when honesty was easy to hear. At the library, no one asked him to explain himself. He volunteered after school. He organized donations, repaired loose book covers, helped older patrons use the computers, and spent hours reading local history. He liked maps, old newspapers, photographs, land records, and anything that revealed how the city had become what it was. He liked history, because history proved that people had existed even when the world tried to forget them. Evelyn had noticed him long before they became friends. At first, Noah had been another quiet boy sitting alone near the window. But then he began asking questions that surprised her. He wanted to know why old books sometimes had handwritten notes in the margins. He wanted to know why city maps showed streets that no longer existed. He wanted to know who decided what was worth preserving. One afternoon, Noah brought Evelyn a small brass key. It was heavy for its size, with a worn oval head and a symbol engraved near the shaft. The symbol looked like a lantern inside a circle. Noah explained that the key had belonged to his grandfather, Arthur Bennett. It was one of only 2 things Noah had left from him, along with an old photograph. When Evelyn looked at the photograph, the past reached out and took hold of her. Arthur Bennett stood beside a younger woman in an office filled with file boxes and folders. The woman wore a navy blouse and had dark hair pulled back from her face. She looked focused, determined, and far less tired than Evelyn remembered feeling during those years. The woman was Evelyn. For several seconds, she could not speak. Noah had never known the full story about his grandfather. He only knew that Arthur had worked for the city, had always spoken about truth, and had died before Noah was old enough to understand why adults avoided mentioning his name. Evelyn turned the brass key over in her gloved hand. The lantern symbol belonged to an old archival system. Before Halston digitized most sensitive records, certain files had been stored in locked cabinets beneath the library. The cabinet numbers were rarely listed in public records. Only longtime municipal employees knew they existed. That evening, after the public rooms closed, Evelyn took Noah down to the lower archive level. The basement corridor was narrow and cold. The lights hummed overhead. The stone walls carried the scent of damp paper and old dust. At the far end of the hallway stood several metal cabinets that had not been opened in years. Most were rusted. Some were sealed with outdated evidence labels. One cabinet bore the same lantern symbol as Noah's key, almost hidden beneath layers of paint. Noah placed the key in the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mechanism turned. Inside, they found a cardboard box tied with brittle twine, several reels of microfilm, a packet of photographs, and a sealed envelope with Arthur Bennett's name written across the front in faded blue ink. Evelyn knew she should have contacted the city archives office immediately. She knew the rules. She knew the procedure. But when she saw Arthur's handwriting, she could not treat the moment like routine paperwork. The envelope contained a letter Arthur had written shortly before his death. It did not include a dramatic confession. It did not name every person involved. Arthur had been too careful for that. Instead, he wrote about fear. He wrote that the evidence they had found had been scattered, altered, and hidden in places no one would think to search. He wrote that Conrad Vale had never feared truth as much as he feared connections. A single document could be dismissed. A witness could be discredited. But if the old records were placed beside one another, they would reveal what had been done. Arthur believed the truth was still alive. It had simply been buried beneath the things powerful people considered worthless. At the bottom of the letter, he had left a sequence of dates, symbols, and file references. Evelyn recognized the system immediately. They were cross-references to municipal filings, redevelopment ledgers, library trust records, and financial documents connected to a charitable foundation that no longer officially existed. The name on the foundation was Vale Community Futures. It was one of Conrad Vale's first philanthropic organizations. Over the following days, Evelyn and Noah worked quietly. Noah helped copy reference codes, organize old files, and compare public records with the materials Arthur had left behind. He did not complain about the boring work. He had Arthur's patience in him, though he did not yet understand how deeply his grandfather had shaped him. Together, they found proof that the library land had never belonged to the city in the ordinary way. The property had been donated in 1912 by Margaret Halston, whose family had funded the original building. Her founding trust included a condition that had slowly disappeared from public summaries over the decades. The land had been given for permanent community use. It could not be sold, leased, transferred, or converted into a private commercial project. If the city ever attempted to do so, ownership would automatically revert to an independent public trust established by Margaret Halston herself. The entire Vale Horizons project depended on that condition remaining hidden. And the condition was recorded inside the original Founder's Register. The Founder's Register was an enormous leather-bound ledger stored in the library's climate-controlled vault. It contained the names of the original trustees, the first donations, the land agreement, and Margaret Halston's handwritten founding conditions. 3 days after Evelyn and Noah discovered the clause, the library board announced that the Founder's Register would be displayed as the centerpiece of the upcoming Halston Heritage Gala. The gala was being promoted as a celebration of the library's future. Conrad Vale would be honored as the man who had saved the building. Donors, politicians, reporters, and business leaders would gather beneath the stained glass ceiling. The original register would be placed under glass as a symbol of the library's history and its bright new beginning. Evelyn read the announcement twice. Then she went to the vault. The Founder's Register was still on its shelf. At first, she almost felt relieved. The leather cover was the right color. The gold lettering appeared worn. The binding carried the same floral pattern. Everything looked exactly as it should. But Evelyn had handled the original register twice before in her career, and she remembered one small detail no copy could easily imitate. Near the lower corner of the true cover was a dark water stain left by the flood of 1947. The book in the vault had no stain. Evelyn stood perfectly still. Someone had already replaced the original. And somewhere inside Halston, Conrad Vale now had the one document that could destroy everything he was trying to build. Evelyn did not touch the false register again until she had taken photographs of every detail that proved it was a replacement. She photographed the smooth lower corner where the flood stain should have been. She photographed the stitching along the spine, too even and too clean for a book more than a century old. She photographed the pages under angled light, revealing fibers that did not match paper made in 1912. Then she went to Martin Gage one last time. This time she did not arrive with a theory. She arrived with evidence. Martin listened behind the closed door of his office, while Evelyn laid the photographs across his desk. Outside, the library remained busy. Children moved through the reading room. A printer hummed near the public computers. Someone laughed softly near the circulation counter. The ordinary sounds made the conversation feel even more unreal. Evelyn explained that the Founder's Register in the vault was not genuine. She explained that the true book contained the original land condition, preventing the library property from being leased for private development. She showed him the forged amendment from 1978 and the archive details that proved it had been created years later. Martin did not deny that the evidence looked troubling, but he was afraid of what the truth would cost. The gala was only days away. Conrad Vale's foundation had already paid for the event. City officials had confirmed their attendance. Newspapers had promised coverage. The library board had built its entire future around the announcement of the Vale Center for tomorrow. If Evelyn was right, the project would not merely be delayed, it could collapse completely. Martin told her that accusing Conrad Vale without official proof would be reckless. He warned that the board would see her actions as sabotage. He said that the city could not survive another public scandal involving the library. Evelyn understood what he was really saying. He believed the library needed Conrad more than it needed the truth. That afternoon, she was placed on administrative suspension. The letter was written in polite language. It claimed that she had accessed restricted material without authorization and caused unnecessary disruption during an important institutional transition. She was instructed not to enter the archive rooms until further notice. For the second time in her life, Evelyn watched a powerful system turn procedure into punishment. The first time, she had been younger. She had still believed that someone would eventually step in and ask what had truly happened. This time, she knew better. She did not argue. She gathered her gloves, her notebook, and the few personal items she kept in her archive drawer. Then she walked through the library without saying goodbye to anyone. Most of the staff avoided looking at her. A few looked sorry. None of them stopped her. That was the part Evelyn would remember most clearly. Not the suspension letter, not Martin's fear, not even the knowledge that Conrad Vale had found a way to rewrite history inside the very building meant to preserve it. What she remembered was how easy it had been for people to remain silent when silence protected them. Noah learned about Evelyn's suspension the following day. He had arrived after school carrying a stack of returned books, unaware that he was no longer supposed to be there. The circulation desk employee told him quietly that his volunteer access had been paused. She would not explain why. At first, Noah thought it was because of Evelyn. Then the security supervisor approached him with a rare 19th century atlas in his hands. The atlas had been found beneath the table where Noah usually studied. It was one of the most valuable items in the special collection. Its pages were delicate, its maps hand-colored, and its cover embossed with the seal of the old Halston Survey Office. It should never have been left in the public reading room. Yet there it was, beneath Noah's chair, as though someone had placed it there specifically to be discovered. Noah said he had never touched it. The supervisor did not accuse him directly. He did something more damaging. He made it clear that the library could no longer trust him around valuable materials. Noah stood in the lobby holding the volunteer badge he had worn for almost a year. Around him, people continued walking past the front desk. Some glanced at him. Most did not. He knew what they saw. A foster kid with worn shoes. A quiet boy without parents beside him. Someone easy to blame because people already believed he probably had a reason to take what did not belong to him. By the end of the day, Noah had been barred from volunteering. He did not tell Evelyn immediately. He waited until evening, then went to her apartment on Grant Street, carrying the suspension letter from the library and the brass key that had belonged to Arthur Bennett. Rain had soaked the shoulders of his jacket. His hair clung to his forehead. He tried to act as though the letter did not matter, but Evelyn saw the way he held it. The library had been one of the only places where Noah had felt wanted without being examined. It had been a place where he could sit beside other people without worrying about whether they knew his history. A place where he could be useful. A place where his questions were welcomed. Now it had become another door closing in his face. Evelyn wanted to tell him that none of this was his fault, but she knew those words would not be enough. Instead, she showed him the evidence she had copied before leaving the archive. The photographs of the fake register, the forged 1978 amendment, Arthur's letter, the notes about the hidden land condition. She told him that the people responsible wanted both of them out of the way because they were getting too close. Noah listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question Evelyn had been trying not to ask herself. If Conrad Vale had taken the real register, where had he put it? The answer came the following morning. Noah had gone behind the library to throw away a bag of old newspapers for his foster mother. Near the recycling bins, he noticed several boxes from Vale Community Futures stacked beside the loading dock. Most were empty packaging from gala decorations, but one crumpled sheet of paper had blown loose from the top of a bin. It was a delivery manifest. The document listed several crates scheduled to arrive before the Halston Heritage Gala. One crate was marked as historical display material. Another carried a more private label, archival handling, restricted access. At the bottom of the page was a reference code. Noah did not recognize it. But when he brought the manifest to Evelyn, she went pale. The code matched one of the references Arthur Bennett had written beneath his letter. It was not a random number. It was an old city archive designation used for sensitive materials moved without public cataloging. The true Founders Register had not been destroyed. It was being transported, and Conrad Vale was planning to bring it into the library on the night of the gala. At first, Evelyn wanted Noah to stay away. She had already seen what Conrad's people were willing to do. They had planted the atlas. They had turned the library staff against him. They had made him look suspicious before he had done anything wrong. But Noah had spent too much of his life being told to sit quietly, while adults made choices that changed everything around him. He did not want to be reckless. He did not want revenge. He only wanted to stop someone from erasing the truth, the way Arthur Bennett's truth had been erased. Evelyn understood that feeling better than anyone, so they made a plan. Evelyn would attend the gala even though she had not been invited. She would remain near the public entrance, where the press and city officials would be gathered. Noah would not confront Conrad. He would only look for the delivery crate and confirm whether the original register was inside. If he found it, he would not touch it. He would send Evelyn a message. The plan sounded simple, but nothing involving Conrad Vale had ever been simple. On the night of the gala, the Halston Heritage Library no longer looked like itself. The children's tables had been removed. The public computers were covered in black cloth. White flowers stood in silver vases beneath the marble staircase. A long carpet stretched through the main reading room, where students usually sat with notebooks and tired parents usually searched for work online. The library had become a ballroom. Guests in tuxedos and gowns arrived beneath strings of warm lights. City officials posed for photographs. Donors drank champagne beneath the stained glass ceiling. A small orchestra played near the old reference desk. At the center of the room, beneath a narrow beam of light, the fake Founders Register rested inside a glass display case. Conrad Vale stood nearby in a black dinner jacket, wearing a silver pin shaped like an open book. He smiled for cameras. He greeted politicians by name. He spoke about education, opportunity, and the future of Halston, with the ease of a man who had spent his life learning how to make people believe that wealth and goodness were the same thing. The guests loved him. They saw the billionaire who had promised $40 million. They saw the philanthropist who wanted to save an old library. They saw the man who had built towers, schools, foundations, and a reputation so polished that few people remembered what might be hidden beneath it. They did not see the forged amendment. They did not see the stolen register. They did not see the evidence Arthur Bennett had hidden 20 years earlier. Noah entered through the service corridor shortly before the main speech began. He wore a borrowed navy suit that was slightly too large at the shoulders. The sleeves were long. The shoes hurt his feet. His tie was not perfectly straight. He looked like a boy trying to belong in a room built for people who had never been told that they did not. Near the loading area, behind temporary catering stations and stacks of wine boxes, Noah found the crate marked for private archival handling. The Vale Community Futures logo was stamped across the side. His heart began to race. The crate had been placed behind a curtain beside flower supplies and event equipment. It was not locked. That seemed wrong to Noah. Something so important should have been guarded. But perhaps Conrad had believed no one would ever look there. Noah carefully lifted the lid. Inside, beneath layers of foam and packing paper, was the original Founders Register. He recognized it instantly. The leather cover bore the dark water stain near the lower corner. The binding looked older, heavier, and more fragile than the polished imitation displayed beneath the ballroom lights. For a moment, Noah could only stare. He thought of Arthur Bennett. He thought of Evelyn. He thought of the atlas planted beneath his table. He thought of every time someone had looked at his foster care file before they looked at his face. Then he made the decision that would change everything. He lifted the register from the crate. He intended to carry it only far enough to show Evelyn. He never made it out of the corridor. 2 security guards appeared before he reached the service door. They moved too quickly. They did not ask why he had the register. They did not ask how he found it. They did not seem surprised at all. They took the book from his hands and led him toward the ballroom. At that exact moment, the orchestra began to fade, and beneath the stained glass ceiling, surrounded by donors, politicians, and cameras, Conrad Vale was preparing to tell the city what kind of future he believed it deserved. When the security guards escorted Noah Bennett into the ballroom, the orchestra had just fallen silent. The sound disappeared so suddenly that the room seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of guests turned toward the boy in the borrowed Navy suit. Under the stained glass ceiling of the Halston Heritage Library, Noah looked smaller than he had only minutes earlier. His hands were empty now. The old founder's register had been taken from him and held by one of the guards as though it were proof of a crime. Conrad Vale stood near the center of the room, surrounded by donors, city officials, cameras, and people who had spent the evening praising his generosity. He did not rush forward. He did not raise his voice. He understood that real power rarely needed to shout. Instead, he looked at Noah with carefully measured disappointment. To the guests, it seemed obvious what had happened. A foster boy had been found in a private service corridor, carrying the most valuable historical document in the library. The evidence looked simple. The story felt complete. And because Noah was young, poor, unknown, and already viewed with suspicion by people who had never bothered to know him, most of the room had decided he was guilty before anyone asked a single question. No one asked why a frightened 15-year-old would steal a book he could not sell. No one asked why security found him so quickly. No one asked why the original register had been stored inside a crate belonging to Conrad Vale's own foundation. They only saw what Conrad wanted them to see. The billionaire spoke to the room with a sadness that sounded almost compassionate. He described Noah as a young person who had been given an opportunity by the library, by the community, and by the very people gathered there that evening. He made it seem as though Noah had betrayed kindness. He made the guests feel sorrow for him, while quietly convincing them that he could not be trusted. It was a performance Conrad had perfected over decades. He knew how to make cruelty look like concern. Noah stood still beneath the stained glass ceiling, his face pale and his shoulders tense. He had spent years learning that when adults had already made up their minds, speaking too much could make things worse. So he said nothing. He only looked toward the rear entrance of the ballroom. That was when Evelyn Hart stepped into the room. She was not dressed like the other guests. She wore a simple dark coat over a plain dress. Her gray-brown hair was pinned neatly behind her head, and beneath one arm she carried the leather portfolio containing every piece of evidence she had managed to collect before Conrad's people pushed her out of the library. For a moment, no one noticed her. Then Conrad Vale did. His expression changed only slightly. It was small enough that most people missed it. But Evelyn saw the shift in his eyes. For the first time that night, the man who had controlled every detail of the gala looked uncertain. Evelyn walked past the donors, the board members, the city officials, and the photographers. She moved without hurry, but she did not hesitate. She had spent 20 years avoiding rooms like this one. 20 years allowing people to remember her as the woman who had supposedly betrayed the city. 20 years carrying the knowledge that the truth had been buried because no one important wanted to hear it. But this was no longer only about her. It was about Noah. It was about Arthur Bennett. It was about a library that had been built for people who had nowhere else to go. Evelyn stopped beside Noah and looked directly at the Founders Register in the guard's hands. Then she looked toward the glass display case in the center of the ballroom. Inside the case, beneath a narrow beam of warm light, rested another version of the Founders Register. The guests did not understand what they were seeing. 2 old leather books could look nearly identical from a distance, but Evelyn did not need to touch them to know which one was real. The register beneath the glass was the forgery. The book Noah had found was the original. Evelyn told the room that Noah had not stolen anything. The real Founders Register had been removed from the library vault and replaced with a false copy. Noah had found the original book hidden inside a crate, marked for private archival handling, a crate delivered by Vale Community Futures. A ripple moved through the crowd. Conrad responded calmly. He suggested that Evelyn was making another accusation without proof. He reminded the guests, in careful and indirect language, that she had once been involved in a financial scandal with the city. He wanted the room to remember her as a disgraced former auditor, not as the woman standing before them with evidence. It was the same weapon he had used 20 years earlier. But Evelyn had not come unprepared. She opened her portfolio and placed several photographs on a nearby table. The first showed the original register's old water stain, the dark mark near the lower corner of the leather cover caused by the Halston flood of 1947. The second showed the book currently displayed beneath the glass, smooth and spotless in the exact place where the stain should have been. The third showed the forged 1978 amendment that had supposedly allowed the library land to be leased to Vale Horizons. Then Evelyn began explaining the details. The register in the display case had been made with modern leather. Its gold edges had been chemically aged. Its thread stitching was too regular, too clean, and too new. The paper inside carried a watermark from a mill that did not exist in 1912. The pages had been machine-trimmed, while the original book's pages were uneven because they had been cut by hand. To many people in the room, those differences seemed small, but small details were often where lies failed. Evelyn pointed toward the register Noah had found. The true book carried the old flood stain. Its leather had darkened naturally over more than a century. Its binding was heavier. Its paper showed the irregular fibers of handmade archival stock. Every mark on it told the story of time. The forgery only told the story of someone trying to erase that time. A woman near the front stepped forward. Her name was Dr. Maya Collins, a historical preservation professor from Halston University. Conrad had invited her to the gala because he expected her to praise the renovation project and speak about the importance of preserving the library's heritage. Instead, she examined Evelyn's photographs, then looked carefully at the book beneath the glass, and finally turned toward the register held by security. Her expression tightened. She confirmed that Evelyn was correct. The book in the display case was not the original Founders Register. It was a reproduction. The ballroom changed in an instant. Until that moment, Conrad Vale had controlled the story. He had been the benefactor. Noah had been the thief. Evelyn had been the bitter former employee trying to ruin a charitable evening. But now, with one expert confirmation, the entire room had to consider another possibility. What if the boy had been telling the truth? What if the woman they had dismissed was right? What if the man they had spent years admiring was hiding something far worse than a forged book? Conrad tried to regain control. He suggested that the reproduction might have been created for preservation purposes. He implied that his foundation had simply handled the materials incorrectly. He said the original register may have been moved without his knowledge. But Evelyn placed the delivery manifest beside the photographs. It showed the private archival crate scheduled through Vale Community Futures. The reference number matched one of Arthur Bennett's old archival codes. Then Evelyn revealed the photograph Noah had found online, taken earlier that evening by a catering employee. In the background, clearly visible behind the flower arrangements, was the crate being moved into the loading area by a Vale Community Futures staff member. The register had not been misplaced. It had been hidden. And it had been hidden by people connected directly to Conrad Vale. Noah finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room because no one else moved. He explained that he had found the real register inside the crate. He said he had recognized the water stain because Evelyn had described it to him. He did not claim to understand every detail. He did not try to sound brave. He simply told the truth. And because he did not ask for sympathy, the truth sounded stronger. For the first time that night, the guests looked at Noah differently. They no longer saw a foster boy caught with stolen property. They saw a child who had been placed at the center of a lie. Evelyn asked the guard to place the real founder's register on the table. Dr. Collins put on archival gloves. Evelyn did the same. Together, they opened the heavy leather cover. The first pages contained the names of the original trustees, the handwritten donations that funded the building, and the founding records of the library. The ink had faded from black to brown, but it was still readable. The pages were delicate, but they carried the weight of a century. Then Evelyn turned to the section that mattered most. There, in Margaret Halston's original handwriting, was the condition that Conrad Vale had tried to erase. The land beneath the library had been donated for permanent public use. It could not be sold, leased, transferred, or converted into private commercial property. If the city ever attempted to use the land for private development, ownership would automatically revert to the Halston Community Trust. The Vale Center for Tomorrow had been built on an illegal promise. The 99-year lease Conrad planned to use was invalid. His $40 million donation had never been a rescue plan. It had been the first step in taking control of land that did not belong to him. The room became quieter than before. Somewhere near the back, a glass touched the floor and shattered. But the biggest revelation had not yet arrived. Evelyn had spent days studying Arthur Bennett's letter. She had understood that his codes were more than references to missing files. They were instructions. Arthur had hidden something inside the one object Conrad would never dare destroy openly. Near the back cover of the Founder's Register, beneath a narrow strip of worn leather, Evelyn found an old stitched seam. It had been repaired after the flood decades earlier. To anyone else, it looked like ordinary restoration work. But Arthur had known the library well. He had known that old repairs were often ignored because people assumed they had no importance. He had trusted that one day, someone would understand the clue he had left behind. Evelyn carefully loosened the seam. Inside the spine of the register was a folded packet wrapped in wax paper. The packet had been hidden there for 20 years. Evelyn opened it slowly. Inside were 3 things. The first was a notarized statement written by Arthur Bennett. In it, he described how he and Evelyn had uncovered altered land records, falsified redevelopment contracts, and diverted public funds linked to Conrad Vale's earliest business operations. The second was a duplicate ledger containing transaction codes that matched the irregularities Evelyn had discovered before the city accused her of fraud. The third was a list of account numbers, shell companies, transfer dates, and financial references connecting Vale Community Futures to the same network of accounts that had existed 20 years earlier under different names. The past had not disappeared. Arthur had preserved it. He had hidden it inside the very book Conrad had tried to replace with a beautiful lie. Conrad reached toward the table. It was only a small movement, but everyone saw it. Until that moment, he had remained composed. Men like Conrad Vale did not collapse the way ordinary people imagined. They had spent too many years practicing dignity in public. But when he saw Arthur's statement in Evelyn's hands, the color left his face. He knew exactly what the documents meant. The forged amendment connected to the false register. The false register connected to the illegal lease. The lease connected to Vale Horizons. The ledger connected to the redevelopment fraud from 20 years earlier. And the old case against Evelyn Hart was no longer a forgotten scandal. It was evidence. The ballroom did not erupt at once. At first, people simply stared. The mayor stepped away from Conrad. The library board chair lowered her glass. Reporters began moving closer, their phones raised, their cameras recording. Dr. Collins continued examining the documents. Her silence carried more weight than any dramatic announcement. Then someone from the city attorney's office stepped forward and requested that the founder's register, Arthur's statement, the ledger, and all related transfer documents be secured immediately. The gala was suspended. The auction never began. Conrad tried to speak privately with the board members, but privacy had disappeared from the room. The donors who had praised him all evening were suddenly eager to distance themselves. The officials who supported the lease began insisting that they had trusted the legal review process. The people who had benefited from Conrad's power discovered that they had never really known him. That was not entirely true. Some of them had known enough. They had simply decided that knowing was less important than staying close to him. Noah was released from security custody before the police even arrived. The guards apologized in the stiff, uncomfortable way people apologized when they realized they had treated a child like a criminal because it was easier than questioning a wealthy man. Noah did not say much. His hands were still shaking. Evelyn stood beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Noah looked at the old photograph Evelyn had brought in her portfolio. Arthur Bennett stood beside the younger version of Evelyn, both of them surrounded by file boxes and records that no one had wanted to believe. For the first time, Noah understood that his grandfather had not died as a forgotten man. Arthur had spent his final years protecting the truth for people he would never live long enough to meet. And Evelyn understood something too. Arthur had trusted the future more than he had trusted the present. He had hidden the evidence because he believed that someday, someone would be brave enough to find it. The first headlines appeared before midnight. By morning, Halston was no longer talking about Conrad Vale's donation. It was talking about forged documents, hidden ledgers, a stolen historical register, and a foster boy who had been accused of theft while holding the evidence that could expose one of the city's most powerful men. The investigation did not end in a single night. Real justice rarely does. For weeks, state auditors examined records connected to Vale Horizons, Vale Community Futures, and several companies that had been created and dissolved over the past 2 decades. Investigators reopened the case against Evelyn Hart. Former city employees were interviewed. Some had been too afraid to speak years earlier. Some had seen files disappear. Some had been pressured to revise dates, remove pages, or approve financial transfers they did not understand. One former accountant described being told that certain payments should never be questioned, because Conrad Vale had influential friends. Another employee from Vale Community Futures provided internal emails showing that the original founder's register had been moved without library authorization. A retired clerk confirmed that Arthur Bennett had warned the city about altered deeds long before he was dismissed. The deeper investigators looked, the more they found. Conrad Vale had not built his entire empire through fraud. That was what made the truth even more disturbing. His businesses had been large enough, successful enough, and respectable enough on the surface to hide the parts that were not. He had used real projects, real donations, and real public goodwill as cover for a pattern of manipulation that had begun long before most people at the gala knew his name. The library lease was canceled. The city was forced to acknowledge that the land could not be transferred for private benefit. The Halston Community Trust took legal control of the property under Margaret Halston's original founding condition. The old building would remain public. Conrad's commercial development plan was abandoned. His foundation board removed him from leadership. Major donors withdrew support. Politicians who had once praised him began claiming they had been deceived. His company lost contracts. His reputation, built carefully over decades, began to collapse under the weight of documents he had assumed no one would ever find. Months later, Conrad Vale was charged with document forgery, financial fraud, obstruction of a public investigation, conspiracy to manipulate municipal records, and the false accusation of a minor. He was not destroyed because someone shouted louder than he did. He was destroyed because the records he had ignored finally spoke louder than his reputation. That was the poetic justice of it. Conrad had spent his life believing that buildings were valuable only when they could be turned into profit. He had looked at the library and seen land waiting to be claimed. He had looked at old documents and seen clutter. He had looked at Evelyn Hart and seen a woman whose name could be buried. He had looked at Noah Bennett and seen a boy nobody would defend. But in the end, the old library became the place where his lies were exposed. The papers he considered useless became the evidence that ended his control. The woman he thought he had ruined became the person who restored the truth. And the boy he called a thief became the reason the truth survived long enough to be found. Evelyn's exoneration came quietly. There was no parade, no grand television special, no famous speaker standing beneath the stained glass ceiling. Instead, the city attorney's office released a formal statement confirming that the case against her had been built on manipulated evidence and incomplete records. Her name was cleared. Her professional license was restored. The city issued an apology that was far too brief for 20 years of damage. But it was more than Evelyn had once believed she would ever receive. Martin Gage visited her several weeks later. He looked older than he had before the gala. He admitted that he had failed her. He had wanted to protect the library, but in doing so, he had protected the people trying to take it away. He had confused caution with integrity. Evelyn did not forgive him easily. She did not need to. Forgiveness was not pretending that nothing had happened. She made him understand that institutions were not saved by avoiding conflict. They were saved by refusing to abandon the people who tried to protect them. Martin stepped down as library director at the end of the year. The Halston Community Trust asked Evelyn to return as director of public archives and historical preservation. At first, she hesitated. The title felt too large. The office felt too close to the life she had once lost. But Noah reminded her that the library had never needed someone who looked important. It needed someone who understood what was worth protecting. So Evelyn accepted. The first project she approved was the restoration of the lower archive wing. The second was the creation of the Arthur Bennett Reading Room. It was not a grand hall with marble plaques and expensive furniture. It was a warm, bright room on the first floor where children could read, study, use computers, ask for help with schoolwork, and learn how to search public records. A framed photograph of Arthur Bennett hung near the entrance beside a small brass plaque describing him as a city records clerk who had protected the truth when few others would. Noah attended the opening ceremony in a suit that actually fit. He did not become a millionaire. He did not suddenly inherit a mansion or receive some impossible reward that solved every problem in his life. His foster care situation did not magically become easy. There were still forms, meetings, uncertainty, and memories that could not disappear because one wealthy man had finally been exposed. But Noah was no longer alone. The library hired him as a paid youth archive assistant. He learned how to preserve paper, repair damaged bindings, search municipal databases, and trace the history of buildings that other people passed without noticing. He began taking evening classes through a local college program. For the first time, he had adults who did not see him as a file number or a problem waiting to happen. He had a place where his curiosity was not treated like trouble. He had a future that did not depend on someone else deciding whether he deserved one. Nearly a year after the gala, Noah returned to the lower archive room where Arthur's letter had been found. Evelyn was there, sorting a box of newly cataloged documents. The old brass key rested in Noah's palm. For a long time, he looked at it without speaking. Then he placed it inside a small display case beside Arthur's photograph. The key had once represented a locked past. It had been the only thing Noah carried from a grandfather he barely remembered. But now it meant something different. It was no longer a reminder of what had been hidden. It was proof that some doors stayed closed only until the right person found the courage to open them. The Halston Heritage Library remained standing. The roof was repaired, but not with Conrad's money. Community groups raised funds. Former students returned to donate. Local businesses contributed without demanding that their names be carved into stone. The city restored public support after learning, through humiliation, that libraries were not private charities for the wealthy to rescue. They were public promises. And every day, people continued coming through the library's doors. Children came to read. Parents came to fill out job applications. Older patrons came to sit by the windows. Teenagers came to study or hide from the rain. Most of them never knew every detail of the scandal that had saved the building. They did not need to. The lights were on. The shelves were full. The doors remained open to anyone. That was enough. But Evelyn never forgot the lesson hidden inside Arthur Bennett's letter. Truth does not disappear because it is weak. Sometimes it disappears because powerful people train everyone else to look away. They make doubt feel embarrassing. They make questions feel dangerous. They make ordinary people believe that wealth, confidence, and public applause are the same thing as goodness. But they are not. And in the end, it took a quiet archivist, a foster boy everyone was ready to blame, and a book full of forgotten pages to remind an entire city that dignity does not belong only to those who can afford to defend themselves. Sometimes the people treated as invisible are the only ones still paying attention. Sometimes the things everyone calls old are the only witnesses that never lie. And sometimes justice begins the moment one person decides that silence has lasted long enough. If you believe that truth deserves to be protected, even when powerful people try to bury it, share this story and tell us what you would have done if you had been in that room.